When a lone rancher saves a dying stranger in the desert, he thinks he's chosen mercy. He's wrong. What he's actually done is stepped into the crosshairs of the most powerful tribal force in the territory, warriors who answer to no law but their own. Now, dozens of riders surround his ranch at dawn, silent as death itself. One choice, one night, and everything changes forever. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The desert doesn't forgive. It doesn't negotiate, doesn't compromise, doesn't offer second chances to those who mistake its brutal honesty for cruelty. The land stretches endlessly in all directions, a vast canvas of sun-bleached earth, scattered scrub brush, and wind-carved stone that whispers secrets only the dying get to hear. Out here, 300 miles from anything resembling civilization, nature holds absolute authority. The sun rises like a tyrant each morning, rules with merciless heat through the afternoon, then surrenders to nights so cold they could freeze the moisture in a man's lungs. Ethan Cade understood this better than most. He'd carved his life from this unforgiving frontier with nothing but determination, a rifle, and the kind of stubborn resilience that turns ordinary men into legends or corpses, depending on which side of luck they fall. 34 years old, weathered beyond his age by wind and hardship, Ethan possessed the lean, efficient build of someone who'd learned that every calorie mattered, every movement counted. His face bore the permanent squint of a man who'd stared down too many sunsets, his hands calloused and scarred from 1,000 small battles with barbed wire, stubborn cattle, and the general hostility of existence on the edge of nowhere. His ranch, if you could call it that, consisted of a sturdy timber cabin he'd built himself, a barn that leaned slightly to the left but had weathered 5 brutal winters, a corral that held his few remaining cattle, and approximately 2,000 acres of land that tested his will to survive every single day. No neighbors within 50 miles. No law except what a man made for himself. No mercy from the elements or the occasional drifters who thought isolated meant vulnerable. They learned otherwise, usually the hard way. The sun hung low on the western horizon as Ethan guided his horse, Smoke, a steel-gray gelding with more sense than most people Ethan had known, along the ridge that overlooked the dry riverbed known locally as Devil's Throat. The name wasn't poetry. It was accuracy. During the brief rainy season, water roared through that channel with enough force to sweep away anything foolish enough to be caught in its path. The rest of the year it remained a cracked, dusty scar across the landscape, home to rattlesnakes, scorpions, and the occasional bleached skeleton of something that had wandered in seeking water and found only death. Ethan had been checking his water sources, the 3 natural springs that made survival possible on this godforsaken patch of earth. 2 were running lower than he liked. The 3rd had been fouled by a dead coyote, which meant another day of backbreaking work to clear and purify it. Just another item on an endless list of tasks required to maintain existence in a place that actively worked against human habitation. "Come on, boy," Ethan murmured to Smoke, giving the reins a gentle nudge. "Let's get home before full dark." The horse needed no encouragement. Like all creatures who lived out here, Smoke understood that nightfall brought dangers best avoided. Predators, both animal and human, who used darkness as their ally. The temperature was already dropping, the wind picking up with that peculiar keening sound it made when it swept across the open plain unobstructed. They'd covered maybe another quarter mile when Smoke's ears suddenly pricked forward, his entire body going rigid beneath Ethan. The gelding had never been flighty or nervous without cause. When Smoke said something was wrong, something was wrong. Ethan's hand moved automatically to the Winchester rifle secured in its scabbard alongside his saddle. His eyes scanned the landscape with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd survived by noticing what didn't belong. The desert stretched out in all directions, painted in the amber and crimson hues of approaching sunset. Nothing moved except the wind-stirred brush. But Smoke remained frozen, focused on something down in Devil's Throat. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly, trusting the horse's instincts absolutely. Then he saw it, a shape that didn't fit the natural contours of the landscape. Dark fabric against pale sand, the angular lines of something human-made in a place where nothing human should be. Ethan's jaw tightened. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to turn around and ride away. Whatever was down there wasn't his problem. The frontier had one cardinal rule, etched in blood and enforced by harsh experience: mind your own business. Getting involved in other people's troubles was the fastest way to end up dead or worse. He should ride away. He knew he should ride away. Instead, he dismounted. "Stay," he commanded Smoke, though the horse showed no inclination to follow him down into the riverbed anyway. Rifle in hand, Ethan descended the rocky slope with careful, measured steps. The loose stone shifted beneath his boots, threatening to send him tumbling, but he'd navigated worse terrain. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into undeniable human form. A woman lay crumpled against the base of a large boulder, her body positioned in that unnatural way that suggested she'd either fallen or been thrown there. Her clothing, dark leather and woven fabric of a style Ethan didn't recognize, was torn and stained with blood. Lots of blood. Her black hair spread across the sand like spilled ink, partially obscuring her face. Ethan approached with his rifle raised, every sense on high alert. This could be a trap. Raiders sometimes used wounded decoys to lure Good Samaritans into ambushes. His eyes swept the surrounding area, searching for any sign of hidden accomplices. Nothing. Just the woman, alone and unmoving. He knelt beside her, keeping his rifle within easy reach, and pressed 2 fingers against her throat. A pulse. Weak, thready, but present. She was alive, barely. In the fading light, he could make out more details. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with sharp, elegant features that spoke of heritage, different from any of the nearby settlements. Her skin bore a warm olive tone that suggested she came from somewhere south and distant. The injuries were extensive. A deep gash across her shoulder, still seeping blood. Bruising that suggested broken or cracked ribs. Scrapes and cuts covering her arms and legs. The pattern indicated she'd taken a serious fall. Maybe from a horse at high speed, maybe from something worse. "Can you hear me?" Ethan asked, knowing she was beyond responding but following procedure anyway. No answer. Her breathing remained shallow and rapid, the kind of breathing that said her body was fighting hard just to keep functioning. Ethan sat back on his heels, facing the decision he'd known was coming from the moment he'd seen her. Leave her, and she'd be dead by morning. Exposure, blood loss, or the predators that would smell fresh blood and come investigating. Take her back to his ranch, and he'd be involving himself in something unknown, potentially dangerous, definitely complicated. The smart choice was obvious. The right choice was something else entirely. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, holstering his rifle and carefully sliding his arms beneath her limp form. She weighed less than he'd expected, her body lean and compact in a way that suggested hard living and constant movement rather than deprivation. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, a soft, unconscious sound escaping her lips. Pain, maybe, or some deep instinct protesting the movement. Getting her up the slope while maintaining his footing tested every bit of Ethan's considerable strength. Twice he nearly lost his balance, stones cascading down behind him as he fought for purchase. But he'd hauled injured cattle and broken equipment up steeper inclines. He'd survived this too. Smoke whinnied nervously as Ethan emerged from Devil's Throat with his unconscious burden. The horse's nostrils flared, catching the scent of blood and something else, the unfamiliar smell of a stranger. "Easy," Ethan soothed, approaching slowly. "Just a woman who needs help, that's all." Getting her across the saddle while injured proved impossible. Ethan ended up mounting first, then carefully positioning her in front of him, her back against his chest, his arms supporting her weight while maintaining control of the reins. It wasn't comfortable, and it sure as hell wasn't dignified, but it would get them both home. The ride back to his ranch took twice as long as usual. Ethan kept Smoke to a careful walk, mindful of every jolt and bump that might worsen the woman's injuries. The sun completed its descent, surrendering the sky to a vast expanse of stars that provided barely enough light to navigate by. The temperature continued its nightly plunge toward freezing. Ethan could feel the woman shivering against him. Shock, cold, blood loss, probably all three. "Stay with me," he found himself saying, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just a little farther." When the dark outline of his cabin finally appeared against the starlit horizon, Ethan felt a wave of relief so profound it surprised him. He'd made similar rides 100 times before, but never with another person's life depending on his getting there safely. He dismounted with difficulty, the woman's dead weight making every movement awkward. After securing her as safely as possible across the saddle, he quickly tended to smoke, removing the tack, providing water and feed, murmuring thanks for the horse's steady reliability. Only then did he lift the woman again and carry her inside. The cabin was cold and dark, untouched since he'd left before dawn that morning. Ethan kicked the door closed behind him and moved directly to his bed. The only bed, a simple wooden frame with a corn husk mattress that had served him adequately for 3 years. He laid her down carefully, then immediately moved to light the oil lamps and build up the fire in the stone hearth. Light and warmth flooded the single-room cabin. It wasn't much. Rough timber walls, a few pieces of handmade furniture, shelves holding supplies and tools, the bed, a small table, 2 chairs. Everything a man needed to survive. Nothing he didn't. Ethan had built it all himself, every board and beam cut from timber he'd hauled from the distant mountains. With the fire crackling and the lamps casting warm yellow light, Ethan could finally assess his unexpected patient properly. The blood loss was worse than he'd initially thought. Her clothing, practical gear designed for hard travel, he noted, not decorative or ceremonial, was soaked through in places. "All right," he said to himself, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's see what we're working with." He'd tended injured animals plenty of times, had stitched up his own wounds on more occasions than he cared to remember. Human anatomy couldn't be that different. Moving with methodical efficiency, Ethan fetched his medical supplies. A wooden box containing needle and thread, clean cloth, whiskey for disinfection, and various herbs and poultices he'd learned to make from a traveling medicine woman 2 years back. The shoulder wound required immediate attention. Ethan carefully cut away the fabric surrounding it, revealing a deep gash that ran from her shoulder nearly to her collarbone. Clean edges, he noted. This wasn't torn flesh from a fall. This was a blade wound. Someone had cut her, deliberately. His jaw tightened. Whatever trouble she was running from, it involved violence and people willing to use weapons. "None of my business," he reminded himself firmly, threading the needle. "Patch her up, get her stable, and she moves on. That's it." He worked by lamplight, his hands steady despite the late hour and his own exhaustion. The needle pierced her skin repeatedly, drawing the wound closed with small, neat stitches. She didn't wake, didn't even flinch, which worried him more than if she'd screamed. That level of unconsciousness suggested serious trauma, maybe internal injuries he couldn't see or treat. After finishing the shoulder, Ethan moved to the smaller cuts and abrasions, cleaning each one carefully. Her hands, he noticed, bore calluses in specific patterns, the kind that came from handling weapons and reins from a lifetime of physical training. These weren't the soft hands of someone who'd lived an easy life. He wrapped her ribs carefully, feeling for breaks. 2 ribs on her left side had fractured. He could feel the slight displacement under his careful fingers. Not good, but survivable if she rested and didn't puncture a lung. By the time he'd finished treating all her visible injuries, several hours had passed. The fire had burned low. Ethan added more wood, then stood back to assess his work. She lay still and pale beneath his heavy wool blanket, her breathing slightly more regular than before, but still concerning. He dragged one of his chairs beside the bed and settled in to wait. Sleep tugged at him, but he resisted. If her condition worsened, if she stopped breathing, if fever set in, he needed to be alert. "Who are you?" he asked the unconscious woman, not expecting an answer. "And what kind of hell are you running from?" The night offered no answers, only the steady crackle of the fire and the whistle of wind through gaps in the cabin's timber walls. Ethan woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Pale gray light filtered through the cabin's single window. Dawn, or close to it. He'd fallen asleep in the chair despite his best intentions, his body surrendering to exhaustion sometime in the deepest hours of night. The woman was watching him. Ethan went absolutely still, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, dark, intense, and fully alert, tracked his every micro-movement with the focused attention of a predator assessing potential threat. There was no confusion in those eyes, no disorientation from injury or pain, just pure calculating awareness. "Easy," Ethan said quietly, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "You're safe. You were injured. I brought you here." She said nothing, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flicked around the cabin, cataloging everything, the layout, the exits, the location of his rifle leaning against the far wall, the knife on his belt. A tactical assessment completed in seconds. Water? Ethan offered, slowly reaching for the cup he'd prepared the night before. She watched the movement with unwavering intensity, then gave a single, slight nod. Ethan approached carefully, as one might approach a wounded mountain lion, respectful of its injury but acutely aware it could still tear your throat out. He helped her sit up slightly, noting the way she bit back a sound of pain, and held the cup to her lips. She drank deeply, her eyes never leaving his face. "You had some bad injuries," Ethan explained, setting the cup aside. "Blade wound to the shoulder, cracked ribs, various cuts and bruises. You've lost blood, but you'll recover if you rest." For a long moment she simply stared at him. Then, in a voice roughened by pain and thirst but carrying an accent he couldn't quite place, she spoke her first words. "Why did you help me?" The question caught Ethan off guard. Not "thank you" or "where am I?" but an interrogation of his motives. "Because leaving you to die seemed like a poor option," he replied honestly. "Most men would have ridden past." "I'm not most men." Something flickered in her expression, not quite approval, not quite trust, but perhaps a slight reduction in hostility. She shifted slightly, testing her body's limits, and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her ribs. "Don't," Ethan said firmly. "2 of your ribs are cracked. You move too much, you'll make it worse." "I need to leave," she said, already trying to sit up fully. "You need to heal." "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Ethan interrupted. "Because from where I'm standing, you're in no condition to go anywhere. You try to ride in your current state, you'll be unconscious within an hour and dead by sunset." She glared at him with such intensity that Ethan half expected the blanket to catch fire. But beneath the anger, he could see calculation. She was assessing her options and coming to the same conclusion he had. She was, temporarily at least, trapped by the limitations of her own body. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, trying a different approach. She hesitated, then, "Tala." "I'm Ethan. Ethan Cade. This is my ranch, such as it is. You're about 50 miles from the nearest settlement, 300 miles from anything you'd call civilization." "I know where I am," Tala said quietly, a statement that raised more questions than it answered. "Who cut you?" Her expression shuddered completely. "That's not your concern." "Fair enough," Ethan conceded. "But if whoever did it comes looking for you here, it becomes my concern real quick. So I'd appreciate some warning about what I might be dealing with." Tala studied him for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could afford to share. "There were 4 of them," she finally said. "Raiders. They ambushed me 2 days ago." 4 against 1 and you survived?" A ghost of something that might have been grim satisfaction crossed her face. 3 of them didn't. Ethan absorbed this information. This woman, injured, alone, outnumbered, had killed 3 armed men and escaped a 4th. Either she was lying or she was far more dangerous than her current condition suggested. "The 4th?" he asked. "Tracking me, probably. Or dead in the desert. I don't know." "Great," Ethan muttered. "So there might be an armed raider with a grudge looking for you." "I told you I need to leave." "And I told you that you can't." "Not yet." Ethan stood needing to move, to think. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you're running from, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. But you're here now, you're injured, and I'm not throwing you back out into the desert to die. Give it 3 days. Rest, heal, get your strength back. Then you can move on, and we both forget this ever happened." Tala's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Perhaps she recognized the wisdom in his words, or perhaps she simply lacked the strength to fight both him and her own body's limitations. 3 days, she agreed finally. 3 days, Ethan confirmed. "In the meantime, you stay in that bed, you let your body heal, and you don't do anything stupid. Understood?" The look she gave him suggested she wasn't accustomed to taking orders, but she nodded. Over the following hours, an uneasy coexistence developed. Ethan went about his morning routine, tending to smoke, checking on his cattle, preparing food. Tala watched everything with that same intense focus, tracking his movements even when she appeared to be resting. He made a simple breakfast of cornmeal and dried meat, offering her a portion. She ate mechanically, efficiently, someone fueling their body rather than enjoying a meal. Her movements, even injured, carried a disciplined precision that spoke of extensive training. "You're military," Ethan observed. Not quite a question. Tala looked up sharply. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move, the way you assess threats, those calluses on your hands. That's from weapon drills, hours of practice. You're a fighter, trained and experienced." She neither confirmed nor denied it, returning her attention to her food. The first day passed in careful silence. Ethan completed his necessary chores, always keeping Tala in his peripheral awareness. She slept fitfully, her body working hard to heal. Occasionally she would wake and he would help her drink water or eat small amounts of food. They spoke little beyond practical necessities. That night, Ethan slept on the floor near the fire, his rifle within easy reach. He told himself it was to give her the bed to aid her recovery. The truth was more complex. He wasn't entirely comfortable sleeping in proximity to someone who'd admitted to killing 3 men and might have a fourth hunting her. The second day brought subtle changes. Tala's color had improved, her breathing deeper and more regular. When Ethan helped her sit up to eat breakfast, she moved with slightly more ease, though pain still shadowed her expression. "The shoulder's healing well," Ethan observed, checking the stitches. "No infection that I can see. You were lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Tala replied. "You knew what you were doing. I've stitched up animals before. First time on a person, though." Something that might have been amusement flickered in her eyes. "I've had worse field medicine." "That's not particularly reassuring." This time she definitely almost smiled. As the day progressed, Ethan noticed her attention kept drifting to the window, to the view of the surrounding landscape. She was watching for something, he realized. Or someone. "You expecting company?" he asked. "Always," she replied, which wasn't exactly an answer. That afternoon, while Ethan was outside repairing a section of corral fence, he caught Tala standing by the window despite his explicit instructions to rest. She'd wrapped his blanket around her shoulders and was scanning the horizon with the systematic thoroughness of a sentry on watch. "You're supposed to be in bed," Ethan said from the doorway. She didn't turn around. "I needed to see." "See what?" "If anyone's coming." "The raider?" "Maybe." She paused. "Or others." "What others?" Tala finally turned to face him, and in the afternoon light streaming through the window, Ethan saw her clearly for the first time since finding her. There was something in her bearing, even injured and wrapped in a borrowed blanket, that spoke of authority and command. This was not simply a fighter or a survivor. This was someone accustomed to being followed, to having her orders obeyed. "Who are you really?" Ethan asked quietly. Before she could answer, smoke began neighing frantically from the corral. The gelding's alarm cry, the one he reserved for serious threats, cut through the afternoon air like a blade. Ethan's hand went to his rifle automatically. "Get back to bed. Now." For once, Tala didn't argue. She moved as quickly as her injuries allowed, settling back onto the bed, but keeping herself alert and ready. Ethan slipped outside, rifle raised, scanning the landscape. Smoke continued his agitated calls, pacing the corral fence. The cattle had bunched together in the far corner, their heads all turned toward the eastern ridge. Something was out there. Ethan's eyes swept the terrain, searching for movement, for anything out of place. The desert stretched away in all directions, seemingly empty, but he'd lived here long enough to know that emptiness was often an illusion. Then he saw it. A flash of movement on the eastern ridge. Just a glimpse, there and gone. But enough. Someone was watching the ranch. Ethan remained still, rifle ready, counting seconds. 30, 60, 90. Nothing else moved. Whoever was out there had either withdrawn or settled into position. He waited another full 5 minutes before backing toward the cabin, keeping his rifle raised and his eyes on that ridge. Once inside, he barred the door and moved to the window, maintaining his surveillance. "What is it?" Tala asked, her voice tight with controlled tension. "Someone on the eastern ridge, watching." "How many?" "Couldn't tell. Saw movement, nothing more." Tala closed her eyes briefly, her jaw clenching. "They found me." "The raiders?" "No." She looked at him directly, and he saw something new in her expression. Not fear exactly, but grim acceptance of consequences. "Worse." How about you explain what worse means before whoever's out there decides to make a move? Tala was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. My name is Tala Vera. My father is Rovan Vera, chief of the Kateri people. We control territory that spans hundreds of miles south of here. Mountains, valleys, trade routes. The raiders who attacked me were hired by a rival faction trying to start a war. They failed. But now your people are looking for you, Ethan finished. Yes. And when they find you here, in my cabin, what exactly happens? That depends, Tala said carefully, on how they interpret the situation. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. Meaning if they think you kidnapped me, if they believe you're part of the plot against me, then you die. Quickly if you're lucky. If they think you rescued me, if they believe you acted with honor, she trailed off. Then what? Then you might survive this. Might, Ethan repeated flatly. That's comforting. I'm sorry, Tala said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. You should have left me in that riverbed. Ethan barked a harsh laugh. Yeah, well, too late for that now. He maintained his watch as the afternoon stretched toward evening. The figure on the ridge never reappeared, but Ethan knew better than to assume they'd left. They were out there, watching, reporting back, waiting for something. Orders, maybe. Or backup. Tala remained silent, sitting up in bed despite the obvious pain it caused her. She was preparing herself, Ethan realized. Mentally, physically, getting ready for whatever was coming. How many warriors does your father command? Ethan asked. Enough? That's not an answer. 300 mounted fighters, fully trained. Another 500 who can be called up if needed, plus our allies. She paused. It's enough. Ethan absorbed this information. He'd known there were tribal groups in the southern territories, had heard stories from traders about powerful chieftains and skilled warriors. But he'd never imagined one would end up in his cabin, bringing the full weight of that power down on his isolated ranch. When will they come? He asked. Dawn, probably. It's what I would do. Full light to assess the situation clearly, enough time to plan an approach, but early enough that anyone inside won't be fully alert. You would do? Ethan glanced at her. You've led warriors? I command my father's personal guard. 50 of his best fighters answer directly to me. She said it matter-of-factly, a simple statement of reality. Or they did before this happened. Night fell with the usual dramatic speed of the desert, the temperature plummeting as stars emerged in countless thousands across the black expanse overhead. Ethan built up the fire but kept the lamps low, not wanting to present easy targets if whoever was watching decided to take shots at the cabin. He made a simple dinner, more cornmeal, some preserved vegetables, weak coffee. They ate in near silence, the weight of tomorrow's uncertainty pressing down on both of them. You should run, Tala said finally. Tonight. Take your horse and go. By the time they arrive, you'll be far enough away to claim ignorance, leaving you alone and injured. I'm their objective. They won't pursue you if I'm here. Maybe, Ethan acknowledged. Or maybe they track me down anyway, kill me for good measure, and I die running instead of on ground I chose. You'd die either way. Then I'd rather do it standing. Tala studied him in the firelight, her expression complex and unreadable. You're either very brave or very foolish. Third option, Ethan replied. Just tired of running from things. Spent my whole life moving from one place to another, always chasing something better, always leaving when things got hard. Built this ranch from nothing specifically because I was done running. If this is where it ends, then at least it ends on my terms. Noble, Tala said quietly. But you should know. If my father believes you harmed me, your death won't be quick or easy. The Kateri people have particular views on justice. Good thing I didn't harm you then. Perception matters more than truth in situations like this. Then I guess we'd better make sure the perception is accurate. Ethan stood, moving to the window for another surveillance sweep. Still nothing visible, but he could feel the presence out there, the weight of watching eyes. When they come, you speak first. Make it clear I helped you. That's the truth, and it's our best chance. It might not be enough. It'll have to be. They settled in for what promised to be a long night. Ethan maintained watch and shifts, allowing himself brief periods of rest, but never fully sleeping. Tala dozed fitfully, her body demanding rest even as her mind clearly remained alert to every sound, every shift in the air. Around midnight, Smoke whinnied again, shorter this time, more curious than alarmed. Ethan moved to the window immediately, scanning the darkness. There, a flicker of movement much closer than before. Someone had approached to within 50 yards of the cabin under cover of night. "They're scouting," Tala said from the bed, her voice alert. "Confirming I'm here, assessing defenses." "Should I?" "No, don't engage. They're not here to attack, just to verify and report." Ethan held his position, watching as the shadow moved around the perimeter of the ranch, never coming close enough for a clear shot, even if he'd wanted to take one. After perhaps 10 minutes, the figure withdrew, fading back into the darkness as silently as it had appeared. "One of yours?" Ethan asked. "Probably." That movement pattern, smooth, methodical, professional. Not a raider. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Ethan watched the sky slowly lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray that preceded sunrise. His muscles ached from tension and the uncomfortable chair he'd spent most of the night in. His eyes burned from lack of sleep and constant vigilance. As the first rays of sun touched the eastern horizon, Smoke began moving restlessly in the corral again. The cattle scattered to the edges of their enclosure. Every animal instinct they possessed was screaming danger. "They're here," Tala said unnecessarily. Ethan was already at the window, rifle in hand, watching as the landscape transformed from shadowed darkness to golden morning light. At first, he saw nothing. Then, as if materializing from the earth itself, figures appeared on every ridge surrounding his ranch. Riders, dozens of them, maybe more. They sat absolutely motionless on their horses, silhouetted against the rising sun, a complete ring of warriors surrounding his property. No weapons drawn, no aggressive postures, just overwhelming, undeniable presence. "Sweet Christ," Ethan breathed. "At least 50, Tala said, having moved to the window despite her injuries. "Probably more out of sight. They brought a war party." Ethan counted what he could see. 57 riders visible, which meant Tala was right. There were probably others in reserve or holding the perimeter. Every single one sat with perfect discipline. Not a single unnecessary movement, no talking or gesturing, just silent, patient authority. "What now?" Ethan asked. "Now we wait for my father." Even as she spoke, the riders on the eastern ridge parted, creating a gap through which 3 more horses appeared. 2 were standard mounts carrying warriors bearing elaborate standards, tribal symbols Ethan didn't recognize. The third was a massive black stallion that made every other horse look small by comparison. The man riding it commanded attention like gravity commands falling objects. Absolutely, inevitably. Rovan Vera. Even from this distance, Ethan could sense the chief's authority. He sat straight-backed and confident, his bearing that of someone who'd led warriors for decades and never learned to doubt his own power. As he descended the ridge toward the cabin, the other riders remained motionless, awaiting his signal. "What's he like?" Ethan asked quietly. "Hard, fair, absolutely uncompromising when it comes to protecting our people. If he believes you're a threat to me, to any of us—" Tala didn't finish the sentence. "Comforting," Ethan muttered. Rovan Vera approached alone, leaving his 2 standard bearers at a respectful distance. He dismounted with fluid grace that defied his apparent age. Ethan estimated late 50s, maybe early 60s, but moving with the controlled power of a man decades younger. He wore practical riding leathers adorned with silver and turquoise, his long hair bound back with leather cords, a ceremonial blade visible at his hip. He stopped perhaps 20 feet from the cabin door and simply stood there, waiting. A test, Ethan realized. He was determining whether the person inside would come out willingly or needed to be forced. "I'm going out," Ethan said. "Don't." Tala grabbed his arm. "Let me. You can barely walk, and trying will just prove I held you against your will. I'll go. You stay here until it's safe." Before she could protest further, Ethan unbarred the door and stepped outside into the cold morning air. Rovan Vera's eyes, dark, penetrating, missing nothing, fixed on him with intensity that felt physical. This was a man who'd stared down death countless times and never blinked first. Ethan met his gaze directly, refusing to show fear even though his heart hammered against his ribs. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with implication and possibility. Finally, Rovan broke it. His voice, when he spoke, carried the rough texture of wind over stone, worn by time but unbroken by it. "Where's my daughter?" Ethan's throat went dry, but he kept his voice steady. "Inside, injured but alive." Rovan Vera's expression remained unreadable, carved from the same stone as the mountains that bordered his territory. His eyes, dark as midnight and twice as unforgiving, searched Ethan's face with the precision of a blade testing for weakness. "How did she come to be here?" "Found her 2 nights ago in Devil's Throat, the dry riverbed about 3 miles east. She was unconscious, badly hurt. I brought her back, treated her wounds." Ethan kept his answers direct, factual. No embellishment, no justification, just truth delivered plainly. "You expect me to believe a lone rancher happened upon the daughter of the Kateri chief purely by chance and acted out of simple kindness?" The question carried no accusation, only skepticism earned through decades of navigating political treachery. "I don't expect anything," Ethan replied. "I'm telling you what happened. Believe it or don't. That's your choice." Something flickered in Rovan's eyes, not quite approval, but perhaps recognition of a man who refused to bend under pressure. The chief took a step closer, and Ethan became acutely aware of the dozens of warriors watching this exchange, their hands resting near weapons they hadn't yet drawn, but could deploy in heartbeats. "Who are you?" Rovan asked. "Ethan Cade. This is my land. I ranch cattle, mind my own business, and generally prefer to be left alone. Yet you involved yourself in my daughter's situation. Didn't seem like much of a choice at the time. Leave her to die or help her live. The math was simple." "Simple," Rovan repeated, as if testing the word's weight. Most men would have seen complexity, potential danger, unwanted entanglement, risk to their own safety. They would have chosen differently. "Then most men are cowards." The words hung in the cold morning air like a thrown gauntlet. Several of the watching warriors shifted slightly, hands moving incrementally closer to weapons. Ethan had just called their chief's assertion into question, challenged the logic of caution and self-preservation that governed frontier survival. But Rovan Vera smiled, not broadly, not with warmth, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who just had a suspicion confirmed. "Show me," he said simply. Ethan turned and walked back to the cabin, acutely conscious of having his back to a man who commanded hundreds of warriors and whose judgment of the next few minutes would determine whether Ethan lived to see sunset. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, Rovan following close behind. Tala stood beside the bed, wrapped in Ethan's blanket, her face pale, but her eyes fierce and alert. Despite her obvious pain and weakness, she'd positioned herself in the strongest defensive stance her injuries allowed. She'd die before showing vulnerability to anyone, Ethan realized, even her own father. "Daughter," Rovan said, his voice carrying nuances Ethan couldn't fully interpret. Relief, anger, concern, all tightly controlled beneath iron discipline. "Father," Tala replied, inclining her head slightly but not bowing. "You brought half the guard for one wounded woman?" "I brought enough warriors to level this ranch and everyone in it if necessary. The fact that I haven't given that order should indicate my current assessment of the situation." He moved closer, his eyes scanning her visible injuries with the practiced evaluation of someone who'd seen countless wounds and countless battles. "Tell me what happened." Tala's recounting was precise and clinical, a military report stripped of emotion. "The ambush 3 days ago. 4 raiders, hired and equipped beyond standard outlaw capability. The fight that followed. Her blade work, her tactical retreat, the calculated risk that left 3 attackers dead and her severely wounded. The 4th escaped into the desert. Her desperate flight northward, away from her father's territory, hoping to draw any pursuit away from her people. Collapsing in Devil's Throat with blood loss and exhaustion claiming consciousness. Then waking here, injured but alive because a stranger chose mercy over caution. Through it all, Rovan listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When Tala finished, he turned his attention to Ethan. "You stitched these wounds?" "Yes." "You have medical training?" "I've stitched up cattle and horses. Figured the principles were similar enough." "And if you'd been wrong? If infection had set in? if she died under your untrained care? Ethan met his gaze directly. Then at least she'd have died somewhere warm with someone trying to help, instead of alone in a riverbed being picked apart by scavengers. Seemed like a better option. Rovan studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, harsh bark of sound that contained more resignation than humor. You have no idea what you've done, do you? I saved your daughter's life, Ethan said. Seems pretty straightforward from where I'm standing. Straightforward. Rovan shook his head. Among my people, a life debt is not straightforward. It's complex, binding, and carries obligations that can span generations. He moved to the window, looking out at the assembled warriors waiting in disciplined silence. You've created a situation that requires resolution, and there are those among my council who would argue for certain traditional responses. What kind of responses? Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The suspicious kind, Tala interjected, her voice tight. Some will argue this was coordinated, that you were positioned to rescue me as part of a larger plot to gain leverage over our people. That's ridiculous. Is it? Rovan turned back from the window. A lone rancher, conveniently located along the exact route my wounded daughter fled, who just happened to possess enough medical skill to keep her alive, who gained her trust and brought her into his home. To certain minds, that pattern suggests planning rather than coincidence. Ethan felt cold understanding settle over him. So even though I did the right thing, I'm still under suspicion. Welcome to politics, Rovan said dryly, where good intentions matter less than perceived advantages and potential threats. What happens now? The question hung heavy in the air. Rovan walked slowly around the small cabin, his presence somehow making the space feel even smaller. He touched nothing, disturbed nothing, but evaluated everything. The rough-hewn furniture, the simple supplies, the evidence of a solitary life built through hard work and isolation. That depends, he finally said, on several factors. First, what do you want from this situation? Want? Ethan's brow furrowed. I don't want anything except to get back to running my ranch in peace. No requests for reward, no demands for compensation, no attempts to leverage this situation for political or economic advantage? No. Nothing at all? Nothing except for everyone to leave my property so I can get back to work. Rovan exchanged a glance with Tala, some silent communication passing between them that Ethan couldn't decipher. When the chief spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly, still authoritative but less confrontational. You understand that's not possible. Whether you intended it or not, you've inserted yourself into matters that extend far beyond this ranch. The raiders who attacked my daughter were not random outlaws. They were hired, equipped, and positioned as part of a coordinated effort to destabilize our territorial control. Whoever orchestrated that attack now knows Tala survived. They know someone helped her, and they will want to know who and why. Let me make this simple, Ethan said, his patience fraying. I don't care about your politics. I don't care about territorial disputes or power struggles or whoever's trying to destabilize whatever. I found an injured woman and I helped her because that's what decent people do. That's the entire story. There's no conspiracy, no hidden agenda, no grand plan, just basic human decency, which apparently is so rare out here that everyone assumes it must be fake. The silence that followed his outburst was profound. Even Tala looked slightly taken aback by the raw frustration in his voice. Then Rovan Vera did something even more unexpected than laughing. He pulled out one of Ethan's handmade chairs and sat down, the casual gesture somehow more significant than any amount of formal posturing. Tell me about yourself, Ethan Cade. How does a man end up alone on 2,000 acres of hostile frontier, far from law or civilization, asking only to be left in peace? Ethan hesitated, unsure whether this was genuine interest or some kind of interrogation technique. But something in Rovan's expression suggested the question was sincere, so he answered. Came west 5 years ago from Missouri. Parents died when I was young, bounced between relatives who didn't want me, learned quick that the only person I could depend on was myself. Worked every job you can name, farmhand, ranch hand, railroad crew, freight hauler. Saved every penny, kept moving west until I found land nobody else wanted. Spent 3 years building this place from nothing. It's not much, but it's mine. First thing I've ever owned that someone couldn't take away. And you prefer solitude to company? I prefer honesty to games. People tend to want something, money, labor, loyalty to causes I don't believe in. Out here, alone, there's no pretense. The land doesn't lie. It doesn't manipulate. It either sustains you or it kills you, but at least it's honest about it. Rovan nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he'd suspected. You and I are not so different, Ethan Cade. I also value honesty over political maneuvering, though my position rarely allows me the luxury of such directness. He stood, moving back toward his daughter. Tala, can you walk? If I have to, she replied carefully. Then come outside, both of you. There's a matter that requires public resolution. Ethan helped Tala to her feet, supporting her weight as they moved slowly toward the door. Whatever was about to happen, he had the sense that it would determine not just his immediate future, but the trajectory of his entire life going forward. The morning sun had fully risen now, bathing the assembled warriors in golden light that made their disciplined formation even more impressive. 57 visible riders, Ethan had counted, but now he could see others positioned further out. Scouts on the distant ridges, reserves held back from the main force. Easily 100 warriors total, maybe more. Rovan led them to a position roughly central to the cabin, where all the assembled fighters could see clearly. His two standard bearers moved their horses closer, positioning themselves as witnesses to whatever pronouncement was coming. The chief raised one hand, a simple gesture that somehow carried absolute authority. Every warrior's attention focused on him with laser precision. Warriors of the Kateri, Rovan's voice carried across the assembled force with practiced projection. You were summoned because my daughter was attacked, wounded, and missing. You rode through the night ready to wage war against whoever had harmed her. That loyalty honors our people and honors her. He paused, letting the words settle, then continued. You see her now, alive and recovering, because this man, Ethan Cade, found her dying in the desert and chose to help her. He had no obligation to do so. He gained no advantage from it. He asked for nothing in return. He simply saw someone who needed aid and provided it, despite the personal risk and potential complications. Ethan could feel dozens of eyes evaluating him, weighing him, judging whether his actions deserved recognition or suspicion. The scrutiny was intense and uncomfortable, like standing naked before strangers who held his life in their collective hands. Some will question his motives, Rovan acknowledged. Some will see conspiracy where there is only compassion. Some will argue that no act is truly selfless, that everyone wants something, that trust is foolishness. To those voices, I say this. I have led our people for 32 years. I have navigated countless threats, both obvious and subtle. I have learned to recognize deception in all its forms, and I see none here. He turned to face Ethan directly, his expression grave and formal. Ethan Cade, by the laws and traditions of the Kateri people, you have created a life debt. My daughter lives because of your actions. That debt cannot be ignored, cannot be dismissed, and cannot be left unacknowledged. Do you understand? I understand you're making a bigger deal out of this than necessary, Ethan replied, earning a few surprised reactions from the watching warriors. Rovan's lips twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Nevertheless, the debt exists. The question is how it should be honored. Traditionally, such a debt would be repaid through land grants, livestock, precious metals, or political alliance. However, you've stated you want none of these things. That's correct? Which presents an interesting problem. A debt unpaid creates imbalance, obligation without resolution. It binds both parties in ways that can become complicated over time. Rovan clasped his hands behind his back, the gesture of someone working through a complex problem. Therefore, I propose an alternative resolution. I'm listening, Ethan said warily. From this day forward, you are under the protection of the Kateri people. Any who threaten you threaten us. Any who attack you declare war on our entire nation. Your borders will be respected, your property defended, your safety guaranteed. In exchange, you agree to honor the relationship between our peoples, to treat our traders fairly if they pass through your land, to provide shelter to our travelers if needed, to maintain the peace between us. Ethan considered this carefully. And if I refuse? Then the debt remains unpaid, the imbalance unresolved, and we find ourselves in an awkward position where honor demands acknowledgement but pride prevents acceptance. I'd prefer to avoid that situation. This protection, Ethan said slowly, does it come with obligations beyond what you've stated? Am I expected to provide intelligence, resources, fighters? No. The obligation is ours to you, not yours to us. We protect you because honor demands it. You simply agree not to become an enemy. It was, Ethan had to admit, a reasonable offer. More than reasonable, actually. Protection from a force. This large and well-organized was worth more than gold in frontier territory where law existed only at the end of a rifle barrel. What about those who question my motives? Ethan asked. The ones who see conspiracy? They will accept my judgment or take their concerns to the tribal council, where evidence and logic will determine truth. But I warn you, if evidence emerges that you were part of the plot against my daughter, this protection evaporates instantly and completely. You will face justice, and it will not be gentle. Fair enough, Ethan extended his hand. I accept your terms. Rovan gripped his hand firmly, the gesture sealing an agreement that transcended simple words. The watching warriors responded with a coordinated movement, right fists raised to their chests in what Ethan assumed was a salute or acknowledgement of the bond just forged. There is one more matter, Rovan said, releasing Ethan's hand. The raiders who attacked my daughter were hired by someone with resources and intelligence. They knew her patrol route, her schedule, her defensive capabilities. That level of information suggests a source close to our operations. A traitor, Tala said quietly, speaking for the first time since emerging from the cabin. Possibly. Or a leak, intentional or otherwise. Rovan's expression darkened. Either way, whoever orchestrated this attack will try again. They've invested too much to simply abandon their objectives because one attempt failed. What are their objectives? Ethan asked. Rovan hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal to an outsider, even one now under tribal protection. Finally, he answered. Control of the southern passes. Our territory borders 3 major trade routes that connect the coastal settlements to the inland territories. Whoever controls those passes controls commerce for hundreds of miles. Currently, we maintain that control through strength and strategic positioning. But there are factions, both within our own people and among neighboring groups, who would prefer different arrangements. And killing Tala accomplishes what, exactly? Destabilization, Tala answered, her voice bitter. I command the Eastern Defense Force. Without me, that sector weakens. More importantly, my death would have sparked internal conflict about succession, about who should fill the command void. Factions would form, alliances would shift, and while we fought among ourselves, our external enemies could move freely. Ethan absorbed this information, the political complexity far exceeding anything he'd expected when he'd pulled an unconscious woman from a riverbed. So what happens now? Now, Rovan said, my daughter returns home to continue her recovery under proper medical care. The Eastern Defense is temporarily restructured under my direct command until she's fit to resume her duties. And we investigate who hired those raiders, how they obtained their intelligence, and what other plans might be in motion. And me? You return to your ranch and your cattle with the knowledge that you now have powerful allies should you need them. Rovan gestured to one of the standard bearers, who dismounted and approached carrying a bundle wrapped in treated leather. However, I would be remiss if I didn't provide some tangible recognition of your service. The warrior unwrapped the bundle, revealing a rifle unlike any Ethan had seen before. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Custom metalwork, perfectly balanced stock, precision sights that would make long-range shooting significantly easier. Beside it lay a leather bandolier filled with ammunition, a hunting knife with a bone handle carved with intricate designs, and a small pouch that clinked with the sound of silver coins. I said I didn't want payment, Ethan protested. And I heard you. This is not payment. Payment implies transaction, commerce, exchange of value. This is recognition, acknowledgement of honor through practical means. The rifle will help you defend your land. The blade will serve you in countless ways. The silver will ease transactions when you need supplies. Accept them not as payment, but as tools befitting a man who has earned respect. Put that way, refusal would be insult. Ethan nodded his acceptance, and the warrior placed the items carefully on the ground before him. Tala stepped forward, moving slowly but with determination. She stood directly in front of Ethan, her dark eyes searching his face with that same intense focus he'd noticed when she first regained consciousness. You asked me a question 2 days ago,
she said quietly. You asked why I needed to leave, what I was running from. I didn't answer honestly. You don't owe me explanations.
Perhaps not, but I owe you truth. She glanced at her father, who nodded permission for her to continue. The fourth raider, the one who escaped, didn't run because he was afraid. He ran because he'd completed his primary objective, which was delivering a message. Before I killed the other three, he told me I had two choices: abandon my position and flee into exile, or watch everyone I care about die slowly. The attack wasn't meant to kill me quickly. It was meant to force me to choose between duty and the people I love. Ethan felt cold understanding settle over him. They wanted you to run, to remove yourself from the defense force voluntarily. Yes, a death would create one kind of crisis, but a commander abandoning her post, apparently fleeing in cowardice after an attack, that creates a different kind of crisis, one that destroys reputation, undermines authority, and makes any eventual return to power nearly impossible. But you didn't run. No, I fought. I survived, and I moved north to draw any pursuit away from our settlements. I was trying to reach the northern outpost where I could send word to my father without leading enemies back to our people. She paused. Finding you? That was luck I didn't deserve. Luck or providence? Rovan interjected. The result is the same. You survived, the plot failed, and now we know more about our enemy's tactics and objectives. A thought occurred to Ethan. The fourth raider, you said he escaped into the desert. Is he still out there? Unknown, Rovan admitted. We've had scouts searching, but the desert is vast and a skilled tracker can disappear if he knows the terrain. Why do you ask? Because if he's still alive, he knows your daughter survived. He knows someone helped her. And if he reports back to whoever hired him, Ethan trailed off, the implication clear. Then you become a target as well, Tala finished quietly. I'm sorry. I brought this to your doorstep. You brought yourself to death's doorstep, Ethan corrected. I chose to pull you back. That's on me, not you. Rovan nodded approvingly. Spoken like someone who understands accountability. Nevertheless, the concern is valid. If the fourth raider identifies you as Tala's rescuer, those who hired him may view you as a continued threat to their plans. Which is why the protection I'm offering isn't merely ceremonial, Rovan continued. Starting today, you'll notice increased patrols in this region. My warriors will be watching the approaches to your ranch, tracking any suspicious movement. You won't see them unless you need to, but they'll be present. Ethan wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of invisible guardians monitoring his property, but he recognized the practical necessity. And if the raiders do come, then they'll discover that attacking someone under Kateri protection carries severe consequences. Rovan's expression hardened into something that reminded Ethan why this man commanded hundreds of warriors. We do not forgive attacks on those we've sworn to defend. Movement on the eastern ridge caught Ethan's attention, 3 riders approaching at a controlled gallop. The assembled warriors shifted slightly, hands moving to weapons not in alarm but in readiness, a disciplined response to unexpected arrivals. One of Rovan's standard-bearers rode out to intercept the newcomers. A brief exchange followed, too distant for Ethan to hear. Then the standard-bearer returned at speed. Chief, the warrior said formally, scouts report a body found 6 miles southeast, single male, dead approximately 1 day, bearing weapons and equipment consistent with raider groups. Rovan's eyes narrowed. The fourth attacker? Likely. They're bringing the body now for identification. Within minutes, 2 warriors appeared hauling a canvas-wrapped burden across the back of a pack horse. They deposited it on the ground before Rovan with practiced efficiency, then stepped back to await orders. Tala moved forward despite her injuries, her face set in grim determination. Rovan pulled back the canvas, revealing a man in his late 30s, weathered and hard-looking even in death. His throat had been cut with surgical precision, a single deep slash that would have killed him almost instantly. Do you recognize him? Rovan asked his daughter. Tala studied the corpse carefully. Yes, he was the one who delivered the message, the one who escaped after I killed the others. But I didn't do this. My blade work is different, and I was barely conscious when he fled. Then someone else found him, Rovan observed. Someone who wanted him dead before he could report what he'd learned. Ethan knelt beside the body, examining it with the practical eye of someone who'd butchered countless animals and understood anatomy. This cut is professional, not frenzied, not defensive. Someone skilled came up behind him and executed him efficiently. There's no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. He trusted whoever killed him or never saw them coming. Which suggests, Rovan prompted, either he was killed by an ally who wanted to silence him or by an enemy skilled enough to approach undetected and strike without warning. Given that he was fleeing an attack, my money's on the first option. Tala's expression darkened. They're cleaning up loose ends. Whoever hired these raiders is eliminating anyone who could connect them to the attack. A logical conclusion, Rovan agreed, which means the threat is both more organized and more paranoid than we initially assessed. They're willing to kill their own operatives to maintain secrecy. The implications settled over the assembled group like a heavy blanket. This wasn't simple banditry or even straightforward political maneuvering. This was calculated, ruthless conspiracy, operating with the kind of discipline that suggested significant resources and careful planning. Father, Tala said quietly, we need to return. The Council needs to know what we've learned, and the Eastern Defense needs to be secured before whoever's behind this makes another move. Rovan nodded, then turned to Ethan. Our business here is concluded. You have my gratitude, my protection, and my respect. Use them wisely. He extended his hand once more, and Ethan shook it firmly. One thing, Ethan said before Rovan could turn away. You mentioned that some of your council will question my involvement, see conspiracy and coincidence. How do I know they won't decide to eliminate the uncertainty by eliminating me? It was a blunt question, bordering on insulting, but Rovan seemed to appreciate the directness. Because I have given my word, and my word is absolute law among my people. Any who move against you move against me, and there is no one foolish enough to take that position. He paused. However, you raise a valid concern about perception. Therefore, I will make this announcement formal and public. By tomorrow, every settlement in our territory will know that Ethan Cade is under tribal protection. By next week, the knowledge will have spread to every neighboring group and faction. Your status will be clear and undeniable. Thank you. Rovan mounted his massive black stallion with fluid grace, then looked down at Ethan from that elevated position. We will meet again, Ethan Cade. The world is smaller than it appears, and the circles of power more interconnected than most realize. When our paths cross next, I hope it will be under more pleasant circumstances. Tala approached Ethan one final time, her movements still pained but determined. You gave me my life back. That's not something I'll forget or take lightly. Just heal properly, Ethan replied. Don't rush back to duty before you're ready. Those ribs need time. Spoken like someone who actually understands recovery. She smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Perhaps you should have been a physician instead of a rancher. Physicians have to deal with too many people. I prefer cattle. They're more honest and less complicated. This earned a genuine laugh, quickly cut short as her damaged ribs protested the movement. I like you, Ethan Cade. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish, and I haven't decided which yet. Can't it be both? It usually is. She touched his shoulder briefly, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, then allowed two warriors to help her mount a horse. Even injured and obviously in pain, she sat the saddle with natural authority, a commander who would never show weakness to those she led. Rovan raised his hand in signal, and the assembled warriors responded with practiced coordination. The entire force began moving as one unit, not rushed or chaotic, but organized and purposeful. Within minutes, they'd formed into a disciplined column heading south, back toward whatever home and responsibilities awaited them. Ethan stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge, the dust of their passage slowly settling back to earth. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air, burning away the last traces of night's cold. Around him, his ranch sat exactly as it had before. The slightly crooked barn, the sturdy cabin, the corral with smoke standing patiently, the few cattle grazing on sparse grass. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He walked slowly back to the cabin, collecting the rifle, knife, and silver that Rovan had left. The craftsmanship on the rifle was extraordinary, he noted again, running his hands over the smooth wood and precision metalwork. This wasn't just a tool, it was art disguised as function, the kind of weapon a master craftsman might spend months creating. Inside the cabin, evidence of Tala's brief presence remained. The bed sheet occupied, still bearing the imprint of her form, blood-stained bandages he'd need to burn, the subtle rearrangement of small items that proved someone else had shared this space. Ethan built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, following the familiar routine of solitary morning ritual. But the silence felt different now, weighted with awareness of how quickly isolation could shatter, how unexpectedly the wider world could intrude on carefully constructed solitude. He'd chosen this life specifically to avoid entanglement, complication, the endless demands and expectations that came with human connection. Yet in a single choice, stopping to help an injured stranger, he'd tied himself to forces and conflicts he barely understood. The question was whether he regretted it. Ethan poured coffee into his battered tin cup and walked to the window, looking out across the landscape he'd claimed as his own. The desert stretched away in all directions, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. Somewhere out there, invisible but present, Qatari warriors now patrolled borders they considered worth defending. Somewhere further south, political forces maneuvered for control of passes and power. Somewhere in the shadows, someone plotted attacks and eliminated witnesses. And here, in this small cabin on 2,000 acres of unforgiving frontier, a solitary rancher contemplated how a single act of compassion had redefined his relationship to the entire region. Did he regret it? No. Given the same choice again, he'd make the same decision. Some things mattered more than safety, more than convenience, more than the comfortable isolation he'd worked so hard to achieve. Basic human decency, the fundamental willingness to help someone in desperate need, that mattered. That defined who you were at your core. But he also wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Tala had said it herself. Whoever orchestrated the attack was cleaning up loose ends, eliminating anyone who could connect them to their plans. The fourth raider had been silenced permanently. How long before someone decided that the rancher who'd rescued their target also needed to be eliminated? The protection Rovan offered was real and valuable, but protection implied threat. You didn't need guards unless something worth guarding against existed. Ethan finished his coffee and set the cup down with finality. Whatever came next, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else in his life, directly, honestly, and on his own terms. He had work to do, cattle to tend, fences to mend, water sources to maintain. The daily demands of survival didn't pause for political intrigue or potential threats. He collected his tools and headed outside into the brightening morning, determined to return to the routine that had sustained him through 3 harsh years. But even as he worked, part of his attention remained alert to the horizon, watching for movement, listening for the sound of approaching riders. The desert didn't forgive, didn't forget, and never offered second chances. But sometimes, if you were very lucky or very stubborn, it granted you the opportunity to prove what you were really made of. Ethan intended to take that opportunity and make it count. 3 weeks passed in deceptive calm, each day bleeding into the next with the familiar rhythm of ranch work that had defined Ethan's existence long before a wounded warrior disrupted his carefully constructed solitude. The cattle grazed, the fences required mending, the water sources demanded constant attention. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged, but Ethan had learned to read the desert's subtle language, and the land was speaking in whispers he couldn't quite ignore. Small signs, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Boot prints near the northern spring that weren't his own, carefully obscured but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. The occasional glint of metal on distant ridges when the sun hit at certain angles. Smoke's ears pricking forward at sounds Ethan couldn't hear. The horse's attention focused on empty landscape that somehow didn't feel empty at all. The Qatari warriors were keeping their promise, maintaining invisible patrols around his property. Ethan found their presence both reassuring and unsettling in equal measure. He'd chosen isolation specifically to escape the weight of human observation, yet now he performed every task with the awareness that someone was always watching. He'd tested the boundaries once, riding deliberately toward the eastern ridge, where he'd first spotted movement weeks ago. Before he'd covered half the distance, a rider had appeared on the ridgeline ahead of him. Not threatening, not approaching, just visible. A silent message. "We see you. We're here. Turn back." Ethan had complied, understanding the unspoken rules of this new arrangement. The rifle Rovan had gifted him hung above the cabin door now, cleaned and oiled and ready. Ethan practiced with it each evening as the sun descended, familiarizing himself with its balance and precision. The weapon was exceptional, capable of accuracy at ranges his old Winchester couldn't match. He didn't know if he'd ever need that capability, but the frontier had taught him that preparation mattered more than optimism. On the 24th day after Tala's departure, the pattern broke. Ethan was reinforcing the corral's western fence, replacing rotted posts with fresh timber he'd hauled from the mountains the previous week, when Smoke began his alarm whinny. Not the curious sound he made when spotting Kateri patrols, but the sharp, insistent warning that meant strangers approaching. Ethan dropped his tools and moved immediately for the cabin, his hand finding the reassuring weight of the knife Rovan had given him. The new rifle was inside, too far to reach quickly, but he had his old Winchester slung across his back and a revolver on his hip. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer to the south, moving at an easy pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. They were too far away to identify clearly, but something about their posture and formation felt wrong. These weren't Kateri warriors with their disciplined precision, and they weren't the casual slouch of drifters or traders. These men rode like hunters who'd found their quarry. Ethan positioned himself near the cabin's corner where he had clear sightlines in multiple directions while maintaining cover. His eyes scanned for the Kateri patrols that should be monitoring his property, but he saw no sign of them. Either they hadn't spotted the approaching riders yet, or they were holding position to observe before revealing themselves. The 3 men drew closer, details resolving from ambiguity into clarity, hard faces weathered by sun and violence, practical clothing designed for long-range travel, weapons carried with the casual familiarity of men who used them regularly. The lead rider sat slightly taller than his companions, his bearing suggesting leadership earned through capability rather than appointment. They stopped about 30 yards from the cabin, close enough for conversation, but far enough to prevent any sudden moves from catching them by surprise. Smart positioning, Ethan noted. These weren't amateurs. "That's far enough," Ethan called out, his voice carrying across the distance with authority he didn't entirely feel. "State your business." The lead rider smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Friendly territory, friend. No need for hostility. We're just travelers passing through, hoping to water our horses and maybe buy some provisions if you've got extra to spare." The words were reasonable, the tone almost cordial, but Ethan's instincts screamed warning. Something in the way the other 2 riders had positioned themselves, creating a triangulated field of fire. Something in how their hands rested near weapons while maintaining the pretense of casual relaxation. "Water's free," Ethan replied carefully. "Spring's 100 yards north. Help yourselves. As for provisions, I'm running low myself. Can't spare any." "That's unfortunate," the leader said, dismounting with slow, deliberate movements. "We've been riding hard for several days. Heard there was a rancher out this way. Thought he might be willing to help fellow travelers in need." "You heard wrong. I mind my own business and prefer others do the same." Understandable sentiment. Man builds himself a life out here. He deserves to be left in peace. The leader took several steps forward, still maintaining that false friendly demeanor. "Though I wonder, have you had any visitors recently? We're looking for someone, you see. Young woman, dark hair, might have been injured. Would have passed through this area about 3, maybe 4 weeks ago." There it was. The real purpose of this visit, stripped of pretense. Ethan's expression remained neutral, revealing nothing. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description. Like I said, I keep to myself out here. Don't get many visitors." "Really?" The leader tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan with the focused intensity of someone reading a card player's tells. "Because we heard different. Heard that a certain tribal chief and about 100 of his warriors showed up here not long ago. That's a lot of visitors for a man who keeps to himself." "News travels fast," Ethan observed. "In some circles, yes, especially when it involves matters of interest to our employers." The leader's hand moved incrementally closer to his weapon. "So let's try this again, with more honesty this time. The woman we're looking for, Talavera, she was here. We know she was here. The question is what happened while she was under your roof, and what you told her people when they came collecting her." Ethan's mind raced, calculating options and outcomes. These men knew too much to be random travelers. They'd been sent specifically to investigate what had happened, which meant whoever had orchestrated the original attack was still active, still pursuing their objectives. I found an injured woman in the desert, Ethan said carefully, choosing truth over fabrication because lies required memory and consistency he might not maintain under pressure. Brought her back here, patched her up, and a few days later her people came and took her home. That's the entire story. Nothing sinister, nothing complicated, just basic decency. Basic decency, the leader repeated, as if tasting the words. That's what you're calling it? See, our employers have a different interpretation. They think maybe you were positioned out here specifically to intercept her. Maybe you've been working with the Kateri all along, and this whole isolated rancher act is just cover for something more organized. Your employers are wrong. Maybe, maybe not. Either way, we've got questions that need answering, and you're the only one who can provide those answers. The leader's hand settled fully on his weapon now, the pretense of friendliness evaporating like morning dew. So, here's how this is going to work. You're going to come with us, nice and peaceful, and we're going to have a long conversation about everything you know regarding Talavera, her people, their defenses, and their plans. And if I refuse, then we have that conversation the hard way, and you don't walk away from it. The other two riders had dismounted now, spreading out to create that triangulated position Ethan had anticipated. Either way, you're talking. Only question is whether you're conscious for it. Ethan's hand moved toward his rifle with deliberate slowness, watching all three men for the first hint of aggressive response. I've got a third option. You turn around, ride away, and forget you ever heard about this ranch. Go back to your employers and tell them there's nothing here worth their attention. The leader actually laughed. Bold words for a man facing 3-to-1 odds. You really think you can... The arrow took him through the shoulder before he could finish the sentence, the impact spinning him sideways and cutting off his words in a choked gasp of pain. His companion spun toward the source of the attack, weapons clearing holsters, but two more arrows were already in flight. One caught the rider to Ethan's left through the thigh, sending him crumpling to the ground with a scream. The third arrow missed its target as the final rider dove behind his horse, using the animal as cover while he returned fire with his revolver toward the ridge where the arrows had originated. Ethan moved on pure instinct, dropping low and rolling behind the cabin's corner as bullets chewed splinters from the timber where he'd been standing. His heart hammered against his ribs, the sudden explosion of violence shocking despite his preparation for exactly this scenario. More arrows flew from multiple directions now, not just the ridge but the northern rocks and the western approach. The Kateri warriors had been there all along, watching, waiting, holding their positions until the threat became undeniable. Now they moved with lethal efficiency, arrows finding targets with precision born of countless hours of practice. The final raider managed 3 shots before an arrow caught him in the side, punching through ribs and dropping him beside his horse. The animal bolted, spooked by blood and noise and the chaos of sudden combat. Then silence crashed down like a physical force, broken only by the wounded men's labored breathing and occasional groans of pain. Ethan remained in cover, weapon ready, waiting to see what emerged from the aftermath. Movement on the ridge resolved into a Kateri warrior descending with bow still drawn, his attention fixed on the wounded raiders. 2 more warriors appeared from the northern rocks, then 3 from the west. All armed, all moving with that same disciplined precision Ethan had observed during Rovan's visit. One warrior, older than the others, his face marked with scars that told stories of previous battles, approached the wounded leader and kicked his weapon away with casual efficiency. The raider groaned, clutching his shoulder where the arrow had punched clean through. "Ethan Cade," the scarred warrior called without looking away from his prisoner. "You can come out now. The threat is contained." Ethan emerged slowly, rifle still ready despite the apparent security. Up close, he could see the raiders were all still alive, though badly injured. The Kateri had shot to disable, not kill, a calculated choice that raised questions about their intentions. "You were watching," Ethan said, not quite a question. "We're always watching," the scarred warrior replied. "That's the nature of protection. When these 3 crossed into monitored territory, we tracked their approach. When their intentions became clear, we intervened. You could have stepped in sooner, before they made their threats." "We could have, but Chief Rovan wanted confirmation of hostile intent before authorizing action against potential travelers. Words are cheap. Actions reveal truth. He prodded the wounded leader with his boot. These men revealed their truth quite clearly. The leader spat blood, his face twisted with pain and anger. You can't do this. We're just hired scouts gathering information. Kill us, and you'll bring down consequences your chief won't want to face. Who hired you? The scarred warrior asked calmly. Go to hell. The warrior nodded to one of his companions, who stepped forward and placed a boot on the leader's wounded shoulder, applying steady pressure. The raider's scream cut through the afternoon air, raw and agonized. Who hired you? The warrior repeated, his tone unchanged. I don't. More pressure, more screaming. When it stopped, the raider was gasping for breath, tears streaming down his face. Consortium. Frontier Trading Consortium. They didn't give names. Which consortium? Western Valley Trading Alliance. They paid in silver. Said we just had to verify the woman survived. Confirm who helped her. The warrior eased the pressure slightly. What were your orders after confirmation? Report back? That's all. Just observe and report. Lies, the warrior said flatly, applying pressure again. The raider's renewed screaming lasted longer this time, pushed past the point of mere persuasion into punishment. When it finally stopped, the man was barely conscious. Ethan felt his stomach turn, violence of this calculated variety different from the clean brutality of combat. That's enough, he said quietly. The scarred warrior looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and evaluation. These men came to take you, to torture information from you and likely kill you when they finished. You want mercy for them? I want information without becoming the kind of person who enjoys extracting it, Ethan replied evenly. There's a difference between necessary force and cruelty. Something shifted in the warrior's expression, not quite approval, but perhaps a reduction in skepticism. He removed his boot from the raider's shoulder and stepped back. Very well. We'll transport them back to our territory for proper interrogation. Chief Roven will want to question them personally about this Western Valley Trading Alliance. He gestured to his companions, who began binding the prisoner's wounds with efficient practicality. You should know, this alliance they mentioned controls significant trade infrastructure throughout the Western territories. If they're involved in the attack on Tala, this situation is larger and more dangerous than we initially assessed. Meaning? Meaning this isn't simply about succession or internal Kateri politics. This is about external forces trying to destabilize our control of the southern passes. Trade interests with enough money and influence to hire professional raiders and coordinate sophisticated attacks. The warrior's jaw tightened. We've faced many enemies, but never ones with this kind of organizational backing. While Ethan absorbed this information, the political implications expanding far beyond his understanding or interest. What happens to my ranch? If this alliance is willing to send scouts here once, they'll send more. Yes, they will, which is why we're doubling the patrol presence around your property. Starting today, you'll have at least 6 warriors within immediate response distance at all times. The scarred warrior paused. I realize this compromises the isolation you prefer, but the alternative is allowing you to face these threats alone. I didn't ask for this, Ethan said, frustration bleeding into his voice. I helped one person, one time, because it was the right thing to do. Now I've got trade consortiums sending raiders, invisible guards monitoring my every move, and political conspiracies I don't understand threatening everything I've built. No, the warrior agreed. You didn't ask for this, but you chose it the moment you decided compassion mattered more than safety. Actions have consequences, Ethan Cade. Sometimes those consequences extend far beyond their initial scope. It was the truth, blunt and undeniable. Ethan had made his choice and now lived with its ramifications, whether he'd anticipated them or not. The Kateri warriors worked with practiced efficiency, binding the prisoners and loading them onto their own horses. The wounded men groaned and protested, but resistance was clearly futile. Within minutes, the scene was nearly clear, only bloodstains in the dirt marking where violence had erupted. One more thing, the scarred warrior said as he prepared to depart. Chief Rovan has requested your presence at the Territorial Council gathering next week. He believes you should understand the full scope of what's developing and how your actions have influenced the broader situation. I'm a rancher, not a politician. Nevertheless, the invitation stands. A rider will come for you in 6 days. The gathering is 3 days' journey south, in our central settlement. You'll be provided safe passage, both directions, and guaranteed neutral status during the proceedings. And if I refuse? The warrior shrugged. Then you remain ignorant of forces shaping events around you. That's your choice to make. But ignorance has never protected anyone from consequences. With that philosophical observation, the warrior mounted his horse and led his companions southward, the bound prisoners trailing behind on lead ropes. Within minutes, they disappeared beyond the ridgeline, leaving Ethan alone once more. Except he wasn't truly alone anymore, was he? Somewhere out there, 6 warriors maintained their vigil, watching for threats he might never see coming. The knowledge sat heavy in his chest, a weight he couldn't quite reconcile with his desire for independence. Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon completing his fence repairs, trying to lose himself in physical labor and familiar routines. But his mind kept circling back to the scarred warrior's words and the invitation to attend the territorial council. Part of him wanted to refuse purely on principle, to maintain his separation from politics and power struggles that held no interest for him. But another part, the part that had stopped to help an injured stranger despite every logical reason not to, recognized that willful ignorance served no one. If his actions had truly influenced broader events, if his ranch had become a focal point in conflicts he barely understood, then perhaps he owed it to himself to learn what he'd stumbled into. The decision gnawed at him through the evening as he prepared a simple dinner and sat watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and crimson. The beauty remained constant, unmarred by human complications and political maneuvering. Out here, the land simply existed, indifferent to ambitions and alliances. That night, sleep came in fragments broken by half-remembered dreams of arrows and blood, and choices that multiplied into infinite branching consequences. He woke before dawn feeling more exhausted than when he'd lain down, his body stiff and his mind clouded. The following days passed in strange duality. On the surface, Ethan maintained his normal routines, tending cattle, maintaining equipment, managing water sources. But underneath ran constant awareness of being watched, of existing at the center of attention he'd never sought. Twice more he spotted Kateri patrols, though they made no attempt to conceal themselves now. A silent acknowledgement that their presence was known and accepted, or perhaps a deliberate display meant to deter any additional scouts the Western Valley Trading Alliance might send. On the 5th day after the raid, Ethan stood at his northern spring watching water bubble up from deep underground, clear and cold and essential to survival in this harsh landscape. He'd claimed this land specifically because of these springs, recognized their value when others saw only barren waste. It's beautiful here, in its own way. Ethan spun toward the voice, hand dropping to his weapon, then froze. Tala stood 10 feet away, dressed in practical traveling clothes rather than the torn and bloody garments he'd last seen her wearing. She looked healthy, strong, fully recovered from the injuries that had nearly killed her. But more than that, she looked different somehow, more relaxed, less guarded, as if being home among her people had eased some fundamental tension. "You're supposed to be recovering," Ethan said, releasing his weapon and trying to calm his racing heart. "I recovered. Turns out having access to actual physicians rather than a rancher with veterinary experience speeds the healing process." She smiled slightly, taking the sting from her words. "Though I'll admit, your field medicine was effective if somewhat painful." "How long have you been here?" "About an hour. I've been watching you work. You're very methodical, very focused. It's impressive how much you accomplish alone." Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks, uncomfortable with the praise and unsure how to respond. "What are you doing here, Tala?" "Multiple reasons," she admitted, moving closer to the spring and kneeling beside it to cup water in her hands. "First, to deliver my father's invitation personally, rather than having it passed along by warriors you don't know. Second, to check on your well-being after the incident with the raiders. Third, to see if the image I'd built in my mind matched reality." "And does it?" She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face with that same intensity he remembered from their first conversations. "Yes and no. You're exactly as I remembered, direct, honest, uncomfortable with complexity. But there's also something I missed before, maybe because I was too injured to see it clearly." "What's that?" "Loneliness," Tala said quietly. "You've built yourself a fortress out here. kept the world at arm's length, convinced yourself that isolation equals freedom. But I see it now. You're not free, Ethan. You're trapped by your own defenses. The observation struck closer to truth than Ethan wanted to acknowledge. That's my choice to make. Of course it is. I'm not judging, just observing. She stood, brushing dust from her knees. My father really does want you at the council gathering. There are developments you need to understand, decisions being made that will affect your safety and future, whether you participate or not. The scarred warrior mentioned the Western Valley Trading Alliance. Kael. His name is Kael, and he's captain of our Eastern Scouts. Tala's expression hardened. The alliance is worse than we initially thought. They control 13 major trading posts, have contracts with 4 separate territorial militias, and maintain influence over supply routes that half the frontier depends on. If they're actively working to undermine Kateri control of the southern passes, we're facing an enemy with resources that rival our own. Why target you specifically? There must be easier ways to destabilize your people's control. Because I'm not just my father's daughter, Tala explained. I'm his designated successor. When he steps down or dies, leadership of our people passes to me unless the council overrides that designation. My death or discreditation would throw succession into chaos, create factions fighting for power, weaken us from within while our external enemies press advantages. Politics, Ethan muttered with distaste. Yes, politics. The ugly, necessary machinery that keeps civilizations functioning and occasionally tears them apart. Tala moved closer, close enough that Ethan could see the faint scars on her shoulder where his stitches had closed the raider's blade wound. I understand your aversion to it, truly, but like it or not, you're involved now. The Alliance knows you helped me, knows you're under our protection, knows you possess information about our defensive responses. That makes you a target and a potential asset they'll try to neutralize or exploit. So what? I attend this council gathering, listen to political maneuvering I can't follow, and somehow that makes me safer? No, Tala admitted. But it makes you informed, and information is the only real defense against forces operating in shadows. She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. There's another reason I'm here, a more personal one. Which is? To thank you properly. When I was here before, I was injured, suspicious, focused on survival. I didn't take the time to express genuine gratitude for what you did, so I'm doing it now. She met his eyes directly, her expression open and sincere. You saved my life, Ethan Cade. Not for reward, not for advantage, not because you understood the political implications. You did it because you saw someone who needed help and decided their life mattered more than your own convenience. That's rare. That's precious. And I wanted you to know I recognize it and value it. Ethan felt uncomfortable, heat rising in his face again, unused to such direct appreciation. Anyone would have done the same. No, Tala said firmly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have ridden past, justified it as self-preservation, and never looked back. You didn't. That says something fundamental about who you are. For a long moment they stood in silence, the desert wind whispering through the sparse vegetation around them. Ethan felt something shifting in his chest, some long frozen mechanism beginning to thaw despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance. Will you come to the gathering? Tala asked finally. Ethan looked out across his land, at the cattle grazing and the cabin standing sturdy against the horizon, and the fences he'd built with his own hands. This place represented everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed to achieve. Safety, independence, control over his own destiny. But maybe Tala was right. Maybe isolation wasn't freedom at all, just another kind of cage built from fear and past disappointments. Yes, he heard himself say. I'll come. Tala's smile was genuine and warm. Good. Kael will arrive tomorrow at dawn to escort you. The journey takes 3 days, so pack accordingly. And Ethan? Yeah? Thank you. For then and for now. She turned to leave, then paused. One last thing. At the gathering, there will be people who question your motives, who see conspiracy and coincidence. Don't let them bait you into anger or defensive justification. Stay exactly as you are, honest, direct, unimpressed by posturing. That authenticity will serve you better than any political maneuvering. With that advice delivered, Tala walked toward where her horse waited beyond a low ridge.
disappearing from sight with the same quiet efficiency she'd demonstrated in arriving.
Ethan stood alone beside the spring, processing everything that had just happened and what he'd agreed to. 3 days' journey into Kateri territory, attending a political gathering where he'd be surrounded by forces and personalities he didn't understand, exposing himself to scrutiny and judgment from people who had every reason to question his involvement. It was possibly the worst decision he'd made since choosing to help an injured stranger in a desert riverbed. But just like that first choice, something deeper than logic or self-preservation drove him forward. Curiosity, maybe, about the world beyond his self-imposed boundaries. Or perhaps simple recognition that running from complexity only worked until complexity found you anyway. That evening, Ethan began preparing for the journey, selecting supplies, organizing his ranch affairs to function during his absence, cleaning and checking his weapons. The familiar rituals of preparation grounded him, gave structure to uncertainty. As the sun set in its usual spectacular display, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, Ethan reflected on how drastically his life had changed in just a few weeks. From isolated rancher seeking nothing but solitude to protected ally caught in political machinations involving trade alliances and territorial succession, the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years running from human entanglement, building walls of distance and indifference, only to discover that one moment of genuine compassion had torn those walls down more completely than any amount of forced social interaction ever could. Tomorrow, he'd ride south into unknown territory with warriors he barely knew, to attend a gathering where his presence might help or harm causes he didn't fully understand. It was madness, really. But it was also, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that felt like living rather than merely surviving. Dawn arrived with Kael and 5 mounted warriors appearing on the eastern ridge like figures materialized from the landscape itself. Ethan had been awake for over an hour, his supplies already packed and smoke-saddled, nervous energy preventing any attempt at rest. He'd spent half the night questioning his decision, the other half accepting it as inevitable. The ride south began in near silence, the warriors maintaining a loose protective formation around Ethan that felt both reassuring and constraining. Kael led from the front, his scarred face impassive as he guided them through terrain that shifted gradually from desert scrubland to rolling hills dotted with hardy vegetation that somehow found purchase in the unforgiving soil. "How long have you served Rovan?" Ethan asked after several hours, the silence becoming more oppressive than conversation. Kael glanced back, surprise flickering briefly across his features before settling back into neutral assessment. 23 years, since I was 16 and stupid enough to think warrior life meant glory and honor. And now? Now I know it means discipline, sacrifice, and watching friends die in fights that politics made inevitable. He said it without bitterness, just flat acknowledgement of reality. But I still serve because some things matter more than personal comfort or safety. Like protecting your people. Like protecting the idea that strength can be used for something beyond conquest and exploitation. Kael shifted in his saddle, his attention sweeping the horizon in constant surveillance. The Khatri weren't always as we are now. 2 generations ago, we were scattered clans fighting each other over scarce resources and old grievances. Rovan's father united us, built the council system, established the territorial boundaries. Rovan expanded that foundation, turned us from survivors into a genuine power. What we protect isn't just land, it's the possibility that people can build something better than endless tribal warfare. Ethan absorbed this perspective, recognizing idealism tempered by pragmatism. And the Western Valley Trading Alliance threatens that? The alliance represents a different philosophy entirely. They believe everything, land, water, people, loyalty, can be reduced to transaction and profit. They don't understand why we defend passes we could sell, why we maintain traditional territories when consolidation would be more efficient, why we value independence over economic optimization. Kael's jaw tightened. They see our way of life as obstacle to progress. We see their progress as poison disguised as prosperity. Sounds like both sides think they're right. Both sides probably are right from their own perspective. That's what makes conflict inevitable. Kael raised a hand, signaling a halt as they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley. We camp here tonight. Water source below, defensible position, clear sight lines. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, establishing camp with minimum conversation and maximum coordination, Ethan watched them work, noting how each person knew their role without needing instruction, how tasks flowed from one to another in seamless sequence. This was the product of training and trust built over years of shared experience. That evening, sitting around a carefully controlled fire that produced minimal smoke, one of the younger warriors, a woman named Sarah with quick eyes and quicker hands, finally addressed Ethan directly. "Is it true you stitched the commander's wounds without any real medical training?" "Unfortunately, yes," Ethan replied, "though calling what I did stitching is generous, more like crude approximation of what stitching should look like." Several warriors smiled at his self-deprecation, the tension in the group easing slightly. Sarah leaned forward, genuine curiosity lighting her features. But she survived. The wounds healed clean, no infection, no complications. "That's not luck, that's skill, even if you don't claim it." "Or stubbornness," Ethan suggested. "I wasn't about to let her die after dragging her all the way back to my cabin. Would have made the effort pointless." "You could have left her," another warrior observed, an older man with gray threading through his dark hair. "Most would have. The frontier isn't kind to those who involve themselves in others' troubles. So I've been told, multiple times, by multiple people." Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral upward into the darkening sky. "But I've also spent years avoiding involvement, keeping distance, convincing myself that isolation equals strength. All that accomplished was making me harder and lonelier. When I found Tala, I had a choice. Maintain my principles of non-involvement and let someone die, or compromise those principles and maybe save a life. Turned out the choice was easier than I expected." "Because you valued her life over your comfort," Kale said quietly from across the fire. "Because I was tired of being the kind of person who'd ride past someone in desperate need just to maintain convenient philosophies." Ethan looked up, meeting the scarred warrior's eyes. "We tell ourselves stories about who we are, what we believe, what matters. But those stories only mean something when they're tested against hard choices. I didn't want to find out I was the kind of man who'd choose easy over right." Silence settled over the group, broken only by the fire's crackle and the distant cry of a nightbird. Several warriors exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them that Ethan couldn't fully interpret. "You'll do well at the gathering," Sarah said finally. "If you speak there like you speak here, honest, direct, unconcerned with impressing anyone, you'll earn respect even from those predisposed to doubt you." "And those not predisposed to doubt me?" "They'll wonder what you're hiding," Kyle said with dry humor. "Nobody trusts someone without visible flaws or hidden agendas. But that's politics. Everyone assumes complexity because simplicity feels like deception." The second day brought them deeper into Kateri territory, the landscape transforming from sparse desert to more varied terrain, where streams actually flowed year-round and vegetation grew thick enough to provide real shade. They passed several small settlements, clusters of sturdy buildings housing families who worked the land and maintained the infrastructure that supported the larger tribal structure. People emerged to watch them pass, their expressions curious but not hostile. Children ran alongside the horses for short distances, laughing and calling out questions that the warriors answered with patient good humor. Ethan noticed how the rider's demeanor shifted in these moments, the hard edge of constant vigilance softening into something almost gentle. "They trust you," Ethan observed to Kael during one such encounter. "They trust what we represent, protection, stability, the promise that someone stands between them and the chaos that would consume them otherwise." Kael waved to a young boy who'd asked about his scars. "Trust isn't given freely out here. It's earned through consistent action over time. These people know that when raiders come, we respond. When disputes arise, we mediate. When drought threatens, we coordinate resource sharing. That reliability matters more than any amount of inspiring speeches or grand promises." By late afternoon of the second day, they reached a substantial river cutting through the landscape like a silver ribbon. A well-maintained bridge spanned the water, its construction suggesting engineering skill beyond simple frontier craftsmanship. "The Tariva River," Kael announced. "Natural boundary between our outer territories and the central homeland. Cross this bridge and you're under direct tribal law, subject to council authority and traditional codes. Still willing to continue?" Ethan considered the question seriously, recognizing it as more than mere formality. Crossing that bridge meant accepting jurisdiction he didn't fully understand, placing himself under authority he hadn't chosen. Every instinct screamed caution. "Yes," he said, and meant it. The bridge's timber planks resonated with hollow thunder as the horses crossed. On the far side, 2 guards stood watch, not challenging their passage but marking it, recording their arrival through some method Ethan couldn't discern. The warriors exchanged brief words in a language Ethan didn't recognize, then waved them through. The landscape beyond the river felt different, more deliberately managed. Fields showed evidence of careful irrigation, orchards bore fruit in organized rows, and the paths they followed had been graded and maintained with obvious care. This wasn't frontier existence, but genuine civilization, built and sustained through collective effort and planning. As evening approached, they crested a final ridge, and Ethan saw the central settlement spread below them in the valley beyond. It was larger than he'd anticipated, easily 300 structures ranging from simple homes to elaborate buildings that suggested administrative or ceremonial purposes. Smoke rose from countless fires, the smell of cooking food and human habitation carrying on the wind. "Katerivan," Kael said, a note of pride in his voice. "Heart of our territory and seat of the tribal council. Population fluctuates, but roughly 2,000 people call this place home, with another 1,000 in the surrounding agricultural settlements." "It's a city," Ethan said, surprised despite himself. "It's a community. Cities are about commerce and transaction. This is about connection and shared purpose." Kael urged his horse forward down the slope. "Come, the gathering doesn't begin until tomorrow, but Chief Rovan will want to know you've arrived safely." They rode through broad streets where people moved with purposeful activity, carrying goods, tending animals, engaged in the countless tasks that sustained organized society. Many stopped to watch the newcomers pass, their attention focusing particularly on Ethan with his obviously foreign appearance and outsider status. Kael led them to a large building near the settlement center, its architecture more elaborate than the surrounding structures. Guards flanked the entrance, but they stepped aside immediately upon recognizing Kael, offering respectful acknowledgement to the scarred warrior. Inside, the building opened into a spacious hall where intricate weavings decorated the walls and carefully crafted furniture suggested both function and artistry. A woman emerged from a side room, middle-aged, her bearing radiating authority and competence in equal measure. "Captain Kael," she greeted him formally. "Chief Rovan has been expecting you. He's in the council chamber with Elder Marin, but asked to be notified immediately upon your arrival." "Thank you, Leora. This is Ethan Cade, our guest for the gathering. He'll need quarters and—" "Already prepared," Leora interrupted smoothly. "The Western Guest House, as the chief requested. Private, comfortable, and guarded for his protection." She turned her attention to Ethan, her dark eyes assessing him with unsettling accuracy. "You've caused quite a stir, Ethan Cade. Half the council is curious about you, the other half suspicious. That's a remarkable achievement for someone who simply helped an injured woman." "I'm beginning to understand that nothing is simple when politics are involved," Ethan replied. Leora's smile was brief but genuine. "A lesson many never learn. You might survive the gathering after all." She gestured toward a doorway. "Come, I'll show you to your quarters while Kael informs the chief of your arrival." The Western Guest House proved to be a well-appointed residence separated from the main structures by a small garden. Inside, simple but quality furnishings filled 2 rooms, a sleeping area and a common space with a table, chairs, and a small hearth. "Meals will be brought to you unless you prefer to eat in the common hall," Leora explained. "The gathering begins at dawn tomorrow in the Great Council Chamber. Someone will come to escort you when it's time." She paused at the doorway. "A word of advice, if you'll accept it from a stranger? I'll take wisdom wherever I can find it. Tomorrow, many people will try to determine who you really are, what you really want, whether you represent threat or opportunity. Don't try to convince them of anything. Just be exactly who you are. No more, no less." Authenticity is rare enough in political spaces that it tends to stand out. Tala said something similar. "The commander is wise beyond her years. Listen to her counsel when it's offered." Leora inclined her head respectfully. "Rest well, Ethan Cade. Tomorrow will test you in ways combat never could." After she departed, Ethan explored his temporary home with growing unease. The comfort felt foreign after years of his cabin's Spartan simplicity. The guard stationed discreetly nearby meant protection, but also surveillance. And tomorrow's gathering loomed in his mind like an approaching storm. Inevitable, potentially dangerous, impossible to avoid. He was unpacking his limited supplies when a knock sounded at the door. Opening it revealed Tala, dressed in formal attire that somehow emphasized her authority while maintaining practical functionality. She looked every inch the commander and heir apparent, but her smile remained warm and genuine. "Settling in?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. "Trying to figure out why I agreed to this," Ethan admitted. "Because you're curious despite yourself. Because isolation was becoming a cage. Because some part of you recognized that involvement, messy and complicated as it might be, matters more than comfortable distance." She moved to the window, looking out across the settlement. "My father is pleased you came. He sees your presence as evidence that honor and direct action can still influence events, even in spaces dominated by political maneuvering." "No pressure, then," Tala laughed quietly. "Oh, there's enormous pressure. Tomorrow you'll face the tribal council, 12 elders representing different clans and interests within our people. Some will see you as proof that my rescue was legitimate and honorable. Others will question everything, looking for conspiracy or hidden advantage. Your testimony matters, Ethan. How you present yourself, what you say, how you respond to challenges, it all matters." "What do they need to hear?" "The truth, exactly as it happened. No embellishment, no political framing, just straightforward honesty." She turned from the window to face him directly. "They'll ask about finding me, about your motivations, about what we discussed while I recovered. Some questions will be genuinely seeking information. Others will be traps designed to catch you in contradictions or reveal biases. How do I tell the difference? You don't. You just answer every question the same way, directly and honestly. Consistency matters more than cleverness in these situations." Ethan sank into one of the chairs, suddenly feeling the weight of the journey and the looming confrontation. What if my testimony isn't enough? What if they decide I was part of some larger conspiracy, regardless of the truth? Then we deal with that outcome when it arrives. But I don't believe it will come to that. Tala moved closer, her expression serious. "My father has significant influence, and I command the loyalty of our military forces. Between us, we can counter most opposition. But more importantly, the evidence supports your account. The captured raiders confirmed they were hired by outside interests. The timing and circumstances of my rescue align with random chance rather than coordination. And your subsequent actions, refusing rewards, maintaining distance, living exactly as you did before, those don't fit the pattern of someone working a larger scheme. Logic doesn't always convince people looking for reasons to doubt. No, it doesn't. But combined with your genuine presence and straightforward testimony, it tilts probability in our favor." She smiled slightly. "Have faith in truth, Ethan. It's unfashionable in political circles, but it still carries power when delivered with conviction." They talked for another hour, Tala explaining the council's composition and the various political currents flowing through Kateri society. Elder Marine led the traditionalist faction, suspicious of outside contact and preferring isolation over engagement. Elder Vasha represented the merchant clans, focused on trade relationships and economic prosperity. Elder Torin spoke for the military families, concerned primarily with defense and territorial security. "And your father?" Ethan asked. "Maintains balance between all factions while pushing toward his own vision, sustainable growth, controlled engagement with outside forces, military strength tempered by diplomatic wisdom." Tala's expression grew thoughtful. "He's been chief for 32 years, longer than anyone in our recorded history. That longevity brings stability, but also creates questions about succession, about what happens when he's gone. Which is why the attack on you was so strategic. Exactly. Remove me, and the careful balance my father has maintained fractures. The traditionalists push for isolation. The merchants argue for deeper trade integration. The military factions splinter based on clan loyalties. What my father has built over 3 decades could collapse within months." She met his eyes seriously. "Your intervention didn't just save my life, Ethan. It preserved the stability of our entire political structure. Whether you intended it or not, whether you wanted it or not, your actions have enormous consequences." After Tala departed, Ethan lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and processing everything he'd learned. The political complexity far exceeded anything he'd anticipated. the stakes higher than he'd imagined. One simple choice, stopping to help an injured stranger, had placed him at the center of conflicts involving trade alliances, succession politics, and the future direction of an entire people. Sleep finally claimed him in the darkest hours before dawn, his dreams fragmented and anxious, filled with faces he didn't know asking questions he couldn't answer. He woke to someone knocking insistently at the door. Disoriented and groggy, Ethan opened it to find a young man holding formal attire, dark leather pants, a woven shirt of remarkable quality, and a vest decorated with subtle patterns. "From Chief Rovan," the young man explained. "He thought you might want appropriate clothing for the gathering. No obligation to wear it, but the offer stands." Ethan accepted the garments, recognizing the gesture as both kindness and politics. Appearing before the council in trail-worn frontier clothing would mark him as outsider and other. This formal attire, while clearly Kateri in style, would signal respect for their customs and willingness to meet them on their own terms. He dressed carefully, the unfamiliar clothing surprisingly comfortable once properly adjusted. Looking at himself in the small mirror provided, Ethan barely recognized the man staring back. No longer isolated rancher, but someone who might plausibly navigate political spaces without immediate dismissal. Kyle arrived shortly after, his scarred face approving as he took in Ethan's appearance. "Good. You look less like a lost frontiersman and more like someone worth listening to. Ready?" "No," Ethan admitted, "but I doubt waiting will improve that." The Great Council chamber occupied a massive building at the settlement's center, its architecture suggesting both ancient tradition and deliberate grandeur. Inside, the space opened into a circular chamber where 12 chairs formed a semicircle facing a central floor area. Each chair was occupied by an elder whose bearing and presence radiated authority earned through decades of leadership. Rovan sat at the semicircle's apex, his position denoting his role as chief while maintaining the council's collaborative structure. He nodded slightly as Ethan entered, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps encouragement. Tala stood to one side, her position marking her as observer rather than participant. Her eyes met Ethan's briefly, offering silent support. "Ethan Cade," Rovan's voice carried through the chamber with practiced authority. "You stand before this Kateri Tribal Council as both guest and witness. We have summoned you to speak truth about recent events and to answer questions that affect our people's security and future. Do you agree to provide honest testimony to the best of your knowledge and ability?" "I do," Ethan replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "Then speak freely and answer directly. This council values truth over eloquence, substance over style." An elder near the left end of the semicircle leaned forward. Elder Marin, Ethan recalled from Tala's descriptions. His face bore the deep lines of advanced age, but his eyes remained sharp and penetrating. "Ethan Cade, tell us in your own words how you came to be involved in the attack on Commander Talavera." The phrasing was deliberate, Ethan noted. Involved in the attack, rather than rescue of Commander Tala, establishing bias from the first question, testing how he'd respond to implied accusation. "I wasn't involved in the attack," Ethan said calmly. "I found Commander Tala 2 days after she was attacked, unconscious and severely injured in a dry riverbed approximately 3 miles from my ranch. I didn't know who she was, didn't know about the attack, didn't know anything except that an injured woman would die without help. So I provided that help." "Convenient," Elder Marin observed. "A lone rancher positioned perfectly along the escape route, equipped with just enough medical knowledge to keep her alive but not so much skill as to seem professionally trained. Some might see coordination rather than coincidence in that pattern. Some might see whatever they're predisposed to see, regardless of evidence," Ethan replied evenly. "I can't control what people choose to believe. I can only tell you what actually happened." A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled elders, some surprise at his directness, some appreciation for refusing to be baited into defensive justification. Elder Vasha, a woman whose sharp features suggested constant calculation, spoke next. "What did you discuss with Commander Tala during the time she stayed at your ranch?" "Initially, very little. She was unconscious for the first day, barely coherent the second. When she could talk, she asked why I helped her, told me she needed to leave, and eventually explained that she'd been attacked by raiders. She didn't reveal her identity until her father's warriors arrived." "Did she offer you anything in exchange for your help?" Promise you rewards, political favors, economic advantages? No, I didn't ask for anything, and she didn't offer anything. The entire arrangement was simple. She needed help. I provided it. She recovered enough to leave.
Yet you accepted gifts from Chief Rovan, Elder Vasha pressed. A valuable rifle, a crafted blade, silver coins. That suggests compensation for services rendered. Chief Rovan insisted those weren't payment, but recognition. I accepted them as such, understanding that refusing would have been insulting. Ethan met her gaze directly. If I'd wanted reward for helping Commander Tala, I would have asked for it when I had the chance. I didn't because that's not why I helped her.
Elder Torin, a grizzled warrior whose scars rivaled Kyle's, leaned forward with interest. You claim your motivations were purely altruistic, yet you chose to live in isolation specifically to avoid involvement in others' affairs. That's contradictory behavior. Not contradictory, Ethan countered. Evolving. I built my ranch and chose isolation because I was tired of people's games, their hidden agendas, their constant demands. But there's a difference between avoiding unnecessary social complexity and ignoring someone who will die without help. I may prefer solitude, but I'm not willing to let that preference cost someone their life. Pretty words, Elder Marin said dismissively. But words are easy. Actions reveal truth. You claim you acted from simple compassion, yet your actions have political consequences whether you intended them or not. The Western Valley. Trading Alliance now views you as Katri ally and potential intelligence source. Raiders came to your ranch seeking information. Your presence here, before this council, makes you a political actor regardless of your stated preferences. I understand that, Ethan said, feeling frustration building but keeping his voice level. I didn't ask for those consequences, didn't seek that role, and would gladly return to my ranch and never deal with any of this again. But I also understand that choices have impacts beyond their immediate scope. I made my choice knowing it would complicate my life. I'd make the same choice again because some things matter more than convenience. Rovan had remained silent throughout the questioning, but now he spoke, his voice cutting through the tension building in the chamber. Elder Marin raises valid concerns about trust and motivation, but I would pose a different question to this council. We live in times where conspiracy and calculation dominate, where everyone assumes complexity and hidden agendas. What if occasionally simplicity is exactly what it appears? What if this man truly did act from compassion without ulterior motive? And what does it say about us if we've become so cynical that we can no longer recognize genuine altruism when we encounter it? The silence that followed Rovan's question felt weighted, profound, as if the entire chamber held its breath waiting to see how the council would answer. Elder Marin's jaw tightened, his weathered face set in hard lines of skepticism that decades of political maneuvering had carved there. But he didn't immediately counter the chief's observation, and that hesitation spoke volumes. Elder Vasha broke the silence, her voice measured and deliberate. Chief Rovan raises a philosophical point worth considering. However, philosophy doesn't protect our people from tangible threats. The Western Valley Trading Alliance has demonstrated willingness to use violence and deception to achieve their objectives. They've already sent one team of raiders to this man's ranch. What happens when they send more? What happens when our protection of him draws us into direct conflict with an organization that controls half the frontier's trade infrastructure? Then we face that conflict. Tala spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who'd already made peace with hard choices. The Alliance attacked me, targeted our leadership, attempted to destabilize our entire political structure. They made themselves our enemy long before Ethan Cade entered the situation. Protecting him doesn't create conflict. It acknowledges conflict that already exists and draws a line declaring we won't be intimidated by their proxies and hired killers. The commander speaks from personal investment, Elder Marin observed. Her life was saved by this man. That gratitude, while understandable, may cloud judgment about broader strategic implications. My judgment is perfectly clear, Tala replied, steel entering her tone. I command our Eastern Defense Forces. I've spent 10 years studying tactics, strategy, and the nature of threats facing our people. The Alliance isn't interested in negotiation or coexistence. They want control of the southern passes regardless of who gets destroyed in the process. We can either recognize that reality and prepare accordingly, Or we can pretend that appeasement and careful neutrality will somehow protect us from their ambitions. Elder Torin nodded slowly, his scarred hands gripping his chair's armrests. The military assessment aligns with intelligence we've gathered. The Alliance has been consolidating power, acquiring smaller trading operations, establishing contracts with territorial militias. The attack on Commander Tala wasn't isolated aggression, it was opening move in a larger campaign. Which brings us back to the central question, Rovan said, his eyes sweeping across the assembled council. Not whether Ethan Cade's involvement creates complications, it clearly does, but whether those complications change anything fundamental about the situation we already face. The Alliance has declared themselves our enemy through their actions. We must respond to that reality. How we treat the man who saved my daughter's life is a separate question with different implications. Elder Vasha leaned back in her chair, her calculating expression suggesting she was running through multiple scenarios and outcomes simultaneously. What does the rancher want from this situation? We've established what he's done, debated his motivations, discussed the consequences. But we haven't asked the simple question, Ethan Cade, what do you want? All eyes turned to Ethan, and he felt the weight of expectation pressing down like physical force. He could feel the political crosscurrents in the room, the competing interests and philosophies that made every answer potentially dangerous, depending on who heard it and how they chose to interpret it. So he did the only thing that made sense. He told the truth. I want to go home, Ethan said quietly. I want to return to my ranch, tend my cattle, fix my fences, and live the quiet life I built specifically because I was tired of complications like this. I don't want political alliances, don't want to be protected asset or strategic liability, don't want to attend councils or navigate power struggles I barely understand. He paused, meeting Rovan's eyes directly. But I also understand that wanting something doesn't make it possible. I made a choice, and that choice has consequences I can't escape by wishing them away. So what I want doesn't really matter anymore. What matters is dealing honestly with the reality that choice created. That's remarkably mature perspective for someone who claims to prefer isolation, Elder Marin observed, though his tone had softened slightly. Isolation taught me that running from things doesn't make them disappear, Ethan replied. It just means you face them alone and unprepared when they finally catch up. Rovan stood, the movement drawing immediate attention from the entire council. I propose we address this situation with clarity rather than continued debate. The facts are undisputed. Ethan Cade saved my daughter's life through actions that appear genuinely altruistic. The Western Valley Trading Alliance has targeted both Commander Tala and now, by extension, her rescuer. Our protection of Ethan Cade serves multiple purposes. Honoring the life debt owed to him, sending clear message that attacks on those under our protection will not be tolerated, and denying the Alliance any benefit from eliminating potential witnesses to their conspiracy. You're proposing we formalize his protected status, Elder Vasha said, making its statement rather than question. I'm proposing we acknowledge reality that already exists and make it official through council declaration. Ethan Cade is under Kateri protection. Any attack on him is attack on us. Any threat to his safety is threat to our honor. We make this position clear, public, and absolute. Elder Marin shifted uncomfortably. That strong stance to take over one frontier rancher, regardless of his service to your family. It's not about one rancher, Rovan countered. It's about the principle that honorable action deserves recognition and protection. It's about demonstrating to our own people and to outside observers that the Kateri value integrity and reward courage. And yes, it's about making clear to the Western Valley Trading Alliance that their campaign of intimidation and violence will be met with absolute resistance. The Alliance won't take such declaration lightly, Elder Vasha warned. They'll see it as provocation, as choosing sides in conflict they prefer to keep subtle and deniable. Then they misunderstand the situation, Tala interjected. They chose sides when they hired raiders to kill me. We're simply acknowledging the war they've already started and refusing to pretend otherwise. Elder Torin stood, his movement deliberate and significant. I support Chief Rovan's proposal. The military council has already increased patrols around Ethan Cade's property. Formalizing his protected status gives our warriors clear authority to engage any threats without seeking additional approval. From tactical perspective, clarity serves us better than ambiguity. One by one, other elders began nodding, some reluctantly, others with conviction. The political calculus was shifting, momentum building toward decision that Ethan realized would fundamentally alter his relationship to this entire region. "I call for council vote," Rovan declared formally. "All in favor of granting Ethan Cade formal protected status under Kateri authority. Indicate your position." 8 hands rose immediately. 2 more followed after brief hesitation. Only Elder Marin and 1 other elder, a woman Ethan didn't recognize, abstained, their expressions making clear they disagreed but wouldn't actively oppose the majority. "The council has spoken," Rovan announced. "Ethan Cade is hereby granted protected status under Kateri authority. This decision will be proclaimed throughout our territory and communicated to all neighboring powers, including the Western Valley Trading Alliance. Any violation of this protection will be treated as act of war against our people." The formality of the pronouncement settled over the chamber like a physical weight. Ethan felt something fundamental shift in his chest. He'd entered this gathering as isolated rancher caught in circumstances beyond his control. He was leaving it as recognized ally of a significant power, his safety guaranteed by warriors who'd just declared they'd go to war to defend him. It should have felt reassuring. Instead, it felt terrifying in its implications. The council session continued for another hour, addressing logistics and strategic concerns that flowed from their decision. Increased patrols would be maintained not just around Ethan's ranch, but along all approaches to it. Intelligence gathering regarding the Western Valley Trading Alliance would be expanded and prioritized. Diplomatic channels would be opened with neutral parties to communicate the Kateri position and prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into broader conflict. Through it all, Ethan sat silently, absorbing the reality that his simple act of compassion had triggered political and military mobilization involving thousands of people and potentially reshaping the entire regional power structure. When the council finally adjourned, Ethan felt exhausted despite having done little more than answer questions and listen to debate. Tala appeared at his side immediately, her expression mixing relief and concern. "You did well," she said quietly as they walked from the great chamber. Answering directly, refusing to be baited into defensive posturing. That's exactly what was needed. "I just told the truth," which is rare and more valuable in political spaces than you might imagine. She guided him through corridors he didn't recognize, away from the main thoroughfares where people gathered. "My father wants to speak with you privately before you return to your ranch." Nothing formal or threatening, just conversation. They emerged into a garden courtyard where Rovan waited, his formal bearing relaxed into something more approachable. He gestured for them to sit at a stone bench positioned to overlook a small fountain. "That was more intense than I'd intended," Rovan said without preamble. "Elder Marin can be difficult when he believes outside influence threatens traditional ways, but ultimately the council recognized what needed to be done. You didn't have to push so hard for formal protection," Ethan said. "I know it creates complications you could have avoided. Perhaps. But those complications were inevitable regardless. The Alliance made them inevitable when they targeted my daughter." Rovan's expression hardened momentarily. "What happened in that council chamber wasn't really about you, Ethan Cade. It was about our people deciding what kind of nation we want to be. One that hides from threats and abandons those who've shown us honor, or one that stands firm on principles even when it's difficult. Politics disguised as philosophy." "Philosophy expressed through politics," Rovan corrected with slight smile. "There's a difference, subtle but significant." He paused, his gaze distant. "I've led our people for 32 years. In that time, I've made countless decisions, some wise, some questionable, all of them necessary in the moment. But the decisions I'm proudest of aren't the tactical victories or diplomatic successes. They're the moments when we chose principle over convenience, honor over advantage. Even when those choices created enemies? Especially then. Anyone can make easy choices that benefit themselves. True leadership means making hard choices that serve something larger than personal interest." Rovan turned his attention back to Ethan. "You understand this already, even if you don't think of it in those terms. You made a hard choice when you stopped to help Tala. That choice has cost you the isolation you valued, exposed you to dangers you never sought, entangled you in conflicts you'd prefer to avoid. But you'd make the same choice again, wouldn't you?" Ethan considered the question seriously, thinking about everything that had happened since that night in Devil's Throat. The raiders, the political machinations, the loss of privacy and simplicity that had defined his frontier existence. Yes, he admitted, I'd make the same choice. Because some things matter more than personal comfort. That's the foundation of genuine leadership, recognizing when larger principles outweigh individual preferences. Rovan stood, his movement signaling the conversation was approaching its conclusion. You didn't seek to become an important figure in regional politics, Ethan Cade, but circumstances and your own character have placed you in that position regardless. How you handle it going forward will determine not just your own fate, but potentially the shape of alliances and conflicts across this entire territory. No pressure, Ethan said dryly, earning a genuine laugh from both Rovan and Tala. Actually, enormous pressure, Rovan acknowledged, but I suspect you'll handle it the same way you've handled everything else, directly, honestly, and with stubborn refusal to compromise core principles for convenience. That consistency will serve you well. Kyle appeared at the garden entrance, his scarred face respectful but urgent. Chief, we've received word from our southern scouts. The Western Valley Trading Alliance has requested formal meeting to discuss recent events. They're proposing neutral ground, limited delegations, diplomatic protocols. Rovan's expression sharpened immediately. How quickly? They suggest 3 weeks from now, location to be determined through negotiation. They're moving faster than I expected, Tala observed. The council vote was just formalized an hour ago. They either have remarkable intelligence networks, or they anticipated our decision. Both probably, Rovan said. The Alliance didn't achieve their current power through incompetence. They're smart, well-organized, and they adapt quickly to changing circumstances. He turned to Kyle. Send response acknowledging their request and proposing preliminary discussions about meeting parameters. Be diplomatic but firm. We're willing to talk, but we won't be pressured into unfavorable terms. Kale nodded and departed to carry out the instructions. Rovan watched him go, then looked back at Ethan with expression mixing calculation and concern. This meeting will determine whether the situation escalates into open conflict or finds some form of negotiated resolution. The Alliance requesting it suggests they may prefer diplomatic settlement to military confrontation, which is promising. But it could also be tactical maneuver to buy time while they strengthen their position. Will I need to attend? Ethan asked, not sure whether he hoped for yes or no. Possibly. You're central figure in the incident that triggered this crisis. Your testimony about what happened, delivered directly to Alliance representatives, might help clarify misunderstandings or expose deliberate deceptions. Rovan paused. But that decision can wait. For now, you should return to your ranch, resume your normal life as much as possible. The enhanced patrols will remain in place, and you'll be notified if circumstances change or your presence is required. The return journey to his ranch took 4 days instead of 3, Kyle choosing routes that passed through multiple Kateri settlements to ensure word of Ethan's protected status spread as widely as possible. At each stop, people emerged to see the rancher who'd saved their commander's life, their expressions ranging from curiosity to respect to lingering skepticism. Ethan found the attention exhausting, but he endured it because he understood its purpose, making his face and story known throughout the territory so that protection wasn't just formal decree, but widely recognized reality backed by popular awareness. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking his ranch, Ethan felt relief so profound it almost hurt. The cabin stood exactly as he'd left it. The corral fence still needed repairs he'd abandoned to attend the council gathering, and Smoke waited in the pasture with the few cattle, all of them blissfully unconcerned with politics or alliances. Home, Ethan said quietly, the word carrying weight it hadn't held before. Such as it is, Kale observed, though his tone suggested appreciation rather than criticism. Isolated, demanding, unforgiving, but yours in a way that matters. Exactly. They descended to the ranch, and Kyle helped Ethan unload his supplies before preparing to depart with his warriors. But before mounting his horse, the scarred captain paused, seeming to wrestle with words he wasn't accustomed to speaking. What you did, saving Commander Tala, standing before the council, accepting protection that binds you to conflicts larger than yourself. That took courage of a kind I respect. Kyle extended his hand formally. You've earned more than political alliance, Ethan Cade. You've earned friendship, if you'll accept it from a warrior who's not particularly good at such things. Ethan gripped his hand firmly, surprised by the genuine warmth in the gesture. I'd be honored. Kale nodded once, then mounted and led his warriors back toward Kateri territory, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and his land. The first week back fell into familiar patterns: mending fences, checking water sources, tending cattle, completing the endless maintenance tasks that frontier existence demanded. But underneath the routine, Ethan noticed differences. The way he scanned horizons now wasn't just checking weather or looking for predators, but watching for signs of the patrols he knew were out there. The way he approached his cabin each evening carried awareness that his isolation was no longer absolute, that invisible guardians monitored his safety whether he wanted them to or not. It should have bothered him more than it did. Instead, Ethan found himself gradually accepting the new reality, recognizing that what he'd lost in total independence he'd gained in connection to something larger than survival. 3 weeks after his return, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge. Not a warrior this time, but a young courier bearing a sealed message from Rovan. Ethan opened it to find formal invitation to attend the meeting with Western Valley Trading Alliance representatives, scheduled for 2 weeks hence at a neutral location between their territories. Your presence is requested but not required, Rovan had written in precise script. The choice remains yours, as always. However, your testimony could prove valuable in establishing facts and countering any false narratives the Alliance might attempt to promote. Whatever you decide, know that you have our respect and gratitude. Ethan read the message 3 times, weighing options and outcomes. He could refuse, stay at his ranch, let others handle political negotiations that were never his fight to begin with. No one would blame him for choosing safety and distance over involvement in potentially dangerous diplomacy. But he'd already learned that running from complications didn't actually solve anything. It just meant facing them later from a position of ignorance and isolation. He wrote his response on the back of Rovan's message, "I'll come," and sent the courier back with his acceptance. The meeting location turned out to be an abandoned trading post roughly halfway between Kateri territory and Alliance-controlled settlements. The structure had been neutral ground for decades, used by various groups for negotiations and exchanges when formal diplomatic channels were needed. Ethan arrived with Kael and a small delegation of Kateri warriors 2 days before the scheduled meeting. Rovan and Tala arrived the following day with additional guards and advisors. The Alliance representatives appeared the morning of the meeting itself. 5 individuals led by a woman whose bearing suggested she'd navigated dangerous political waters long enough to become extremely good at it. Chief Rovan, she greeted him formally as both parties assembled in the trading post's main hall. I am Magistrate Celine Varro, Senior Arbitrator for the Western Valley Trading Alliance. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Magistrate Varro, Rovan replied with equal formality. We share interest in resolving current tensions before they escalate beyond diplomatic solution. Indeed. Varro's eyes swept across the Kateri delegation, pausing fractionally when they reached Ethan. I see you've brought the rancher who's become such central figure in recent events. Ethan Cade, I presume? That's right, Ethan confirmed, meeting her gaze directly. Interesting. We've heard conflicting accounts about your role in Commander Tala's rescue and subsequent developments. I'm curious to hear your version directly. Then ask, Ethan said simply. Varro smiled slightly, appreciation for directness flickering across her features. Very well. Did the Kateri people recruit or compensate you in any way to position yourself along escape routes from their territory with instructions to intercept and protect fleeing commanders? No. I've never worked for the Kateri in any capacity. I'm a rancher who happened to find an injured woman and chose to help her. That's the entire story, with no conspiracy or coordination involved. Yet you now enjoy Kateri protection, formal alliance status, and direct access to their leadership. Those aren't typical outcomes from simple Good Samaritan acts. They're outcomes from political situation I didn't create and don't fully understand, Ethan countered. I helped someone in desperate need. What happened after that, protection, formal status, all of it, was offered by Chief Rovan, not requested by me. I accepted because refusing would have been both foolish and insulting, not because it was part of some larger plan. Varro studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her attention to Rovan. The Alliance has conducted investigation into the attack on Commander Tala. We've discovered that 4 individuals operating under fraudulent credentials made unauthorized use of Alliance resources to fund and execute that attack. They acted without organizational approval or knowledge. Convenient discovery, Tala observed dryly, made only after their operation failed and their involvement became undeniable. Nevertheless, accurate, Varro replied smoothly. The individuals in question have been identified and terminated from all Alliance positions. Their actions do not reflect organizational policy or objectives. Which individuals specifically? Rovan asked. Varro provided 4 names, mid-level administrators in different Alliance operations, none of them particularly senior or influential. Exactly the kind of people who could be sacrificed without damaging the Alliance's actual power structure. Scapegoats, Kyle muttered quietly, though loud enough to be heard. Accountability, Varro corrected. The Alliance takes responsibility for actions conducted using our resources. Even when those actions violate our policies, we're prepared to offer formal apology and appropriate compensation for the attack on Commander Tala. And the subsequent attempts on Ethan Cade's life? Tala pressed. The raiders who came to his ranch threatening interrogation and death? Were they also unauthorized actors operating without Alliance knowledge? Something flickered in Varro's expression. Surprise, perhaps? Or calculation adjusting to new information? We have no record of any Alliance resources being directed toward the rancher. If such attempts occurred, they were not sanctioned operations. Interesting how many unauthorized operations seem to align perfectly with Alliance strategic interests, Rovan observed. Control of the southern passes would benefit your organization enormously. Destabilizing Kateri leadership through attack on my designated successor serves that objective. Eliminating the witness who rescued her prevents uncomfortable questions about who really orchestrated the attack. These unauthorized operations show remarkable strategic coordination for random actors pursuing personal agendas. Varro's jaw tightened fractionally, the first crack in her diplomatic composure. Chief Rovan, you can believe in vast conspiracy if it suits your political needs, but the reality is simpler. Rogue elements acted beyond their authority, their operation failed, and they've been held accountable. The Alliance seeks no conflict with Kateri people. We simply want continued access to trade routes and peaceful coexistence that benefits both our organizations. Then prove it, Rovan said bluntly. Public declaration that Kateri territorial sovereignty over the southern passes is recognized and respected. Formal agreement that any future violations will be treated as acts of war rather than unfortunate misunderstandings. Binding arbitration clause for disputes, with penalties significant enough to matter. Those are substantial demands. They're baseline requirements for trust after your people tried to kill my daughter and threatened a man under my protection. If the Alliance truly wants peace, these terms should be acceptable. If you're simply buying time while planning your next move, then we're wasting breath pretending diplomacy matters. The 2 leaders locked eyes across the negotiating space, years of political experience and strategic calculation playing out in silence. Finally, Varro nodded slowly. I'll need to consult with the full Alliance Council, but preliminarily those terms seem workable provided certain trade access guarantees are maintained and tariff structures remain fair. Trade access has never been restricted, Rovan replied. Only military incursions and unauthorized armed presence. Merchants operating in good faith have always been welcome. Then we may have basis for agreement. Varro stood, signaling the formal portion of the meeting had concluded. I'll return to Alliance leadership with your proposed terms. We should have response within 2 weeks. As the Alliance delegation prepared to depart, Varro approached Ethan one final time, her expression thoughtful. You found yourself in remarkable position, Mr. Cade. Protected by significant power, central to diplomatic negotiations, your simple act of kindness rippling into regional politics. Does any of this feel surreal? All of it feels surreal, Ethan admitted. But I'm learning that circumstances don't change who you are. They just reveal it more clearly. I'm still the same person who stopped to help an injured stranger because it was the right thing to do. Everything else is just consequences I'm learning to handle. Wise perspective. Varro extended her hand. For what it's worth, I believe your account. You don't move or speak like someone operating from script or hidden agenda. That authenticity is rare enough to be valuable. Use it carefully. After the Alliance delegation departed, Rovan gathered his own people to assess the meeting's outcome. The consensus was cautiously optimistic. Varro seemed genuinely interested in diplomatic resolution. though whether the full Alliance Council would support those terms remained uncertain. What happens if they reject the terms? Ethan asked. Then we prepare for conflict we've been anticipating anyway, Rovan replied. But I don't think they will. The Alliance is fundamentally a commercial organization. War disrupts trade, destroys infrastructure, creates unpredictable chaos that threatens profit margins. If they can achieve their objectives through negotiation, they'll prefer that path. And if they can achieve their objectives through negotiation, then we remind them why the Kateri have held these territories for generations despite countless challenges. Rovan's expression hardened. We're not invincible, but we're considerably more dangerous than commercial administrators might assume. The return journey to his ranch felt different this time, less anxious and more contemplative. Ethan had entered these political waters reluctantly, driven by circumstances rather than choice. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped fighting the current and learned to navigate it with increasing confidence. 2 weeks later, word arrived from Magistrate Vero. The Western Valley Trading Alliance had accepted Rovan's terms with minor modifications to tariff structures and dispute arbitration procedures. A formal treaty would be drafted and signed within the month, establishing clear boundaries and expectations for both parties. The crisis, it seemed, had resolved itself through diplomacy rather than violence. Ethan received this news while repairing his corral fence, the same task he'd been working on the day Kael first arrived to escort him to the council gathering. The symmetry felt appropriate somehow, returning to familiar labor after journey through unfamiliar territory. But the land felt different now, even as he performed the same tasks he'd done countless times before. The isolation he'd valued so highly had transformed into something else. Not loneliness, but chosen solitude with the awareness that connection existed when he wanted or needed it. Over the following months, the enhanced patrols around his ranch gradually reduced to normal levels as tensions eased and the treaty took effect. Kateri warriors still monitored the region, but their presence became less obvious, less constant. The Western Valley Trading Alliance, for their part, seemed genuine in their commitment to peaceful coexistence, their caravans passing through Kateri territory without incident. Tala visited twice more, checking on Ethan's well-being and sharing updates about political developments he found himself actually interested in. On her second visit, she brought news that made him smile despite himself. The council has officially recognized your ranch as sovereign territory under Kateri protection, but outside direct tribal governance. Essentially, you maintain complete independence while enjoying security guarantees. My father thought you'd appreciate the formal acknowledgement of your preference for self-determination. I do, Ethan admitted, though I'm starting to think maybe total isolation wasn't quite the paradise I'd convinced myself it was. No? Tala's expression turned playful. What changed your mind? Meeting someone who proved that human connection, complicated as it might be, offers rewards isolation never could. Someone who showed me that vulnerability isn't weakness and that caring about others' well-being doesn't diminish your own strength. Tala's smile was warm and genuine. I could say something similar about meeting someone who demonstrated that honor and compassion still exist in a world that often seems dominated by calculation and self-interest. They stood together watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and gold, two people whose lives had intersected by chance and been forever altered by choices made in moments of crisis. Thank you, Tala said quietly, for everything, for saving my life, for standing before the council, for being exactly who you are without apology or pretense. Thank you, Ethan replied, for showing me that the walls I built to protect myself were actually just keeping me trapped, for pulling me into a world I'd been avoiding and proving that engagement, however messy, matters more than comfortable distance. As darkness claimed the desert and stars emerged in countless thousands overhead, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd sought isolation, built fortress against human complication, convinced himself that independence meant avoiding entanglement at all costs. But one choice, one simple decision to help someone in desperate need, had demolished those carefully constructed defenses and revealed fundamental truth he'd been avoiding. Human beings weren't meant to exist in complete isolation. Connection, community, caring about others beyond yourself, these weren't weaknesses to be avoided, but essential elements of what made life meaningful. The months stretched into seasons, and Ethan's ranch gradually transformed from isolated outpost to recognized landmark.
Travelers knew they could find fair treatment and honest dealings at the property under Kateri protection. Warriors passing through the region would sometimes stop to share news or simply rest for an evening. And occasionally, when her duties permitted, Tala would arrive unannounced to spend a day helping with ranch work and talking about everything and nothing. The frontier remained harsh and unforgiving. The desert still tested everyone who tried to claim life from its barren beauty. But Ethan faced those challenges now with knowledge that he wasn't alone, that invisible threads of connection stretched across the landscape, linking him to people who valued honor and recognized that some things, compassion, integrity, willingness to help others despite personal cost, mattered more than convenience or safety. On the distant ridges at dawn, silent figures sometimes stood watch, not because threats required constant vigilance, but because protection once offered was protection maintained. The Kateri people remembered those who showed them honor. They rewarded courage with loyalty that could span lifetimes. And in a small cabin on 2,000 acres of unforgiving frontier land, a solitary rancher who'd once sought nothing but isolation discovered that the greatest strength came not from walls built to keep the world away, but from doors opened to let the right people in. Ethan Cade had saved one life in a moment of compassion that defied caution. In return, that single choice had reshaped alliances, influenced politics, and ultimately saved him from cage of his own construction, proving that sometimes the greatest rescue wasn't pulling someone from physical danger, but being willing to be pulled from self-imposed isolation into fuller, richer existence among people who recognized his worth. The desert didn't forgive, didn't forget, and never offered second chances. But it did occasionally reward those brave enough to choose compassion over caution, connection over isolation, and engagement over comfortable distance. In that harsh and beautiful landscape where survival demanded strength and thriving required courage, Ethan had discovered that the most powerful force wasn't individual resilience, but the bonds forged between people who recognized that some things, honor, integrity, simple human decency, were worth defending regardless of cost. Years later, when travelers asked about the rancher under Kateri protection, they heard stories that grew with each telling. Stories about the man who'd saved a commander's life, influenced territorial politics, and stood before councils without bending to pressure or pretense. Stories about impossible courage and stubborn integrity that refused to compromise even when surrounded by forces that could have destroyed him. But the truth was simpler and somehow more profound. Ethan Cade was just a man who'd made one choice in one moment because it aligned with who he wanted to be rather than what circumstances demanded. That choice rippled outward in ways he'd never anticipated, touching lives and shaping events far beyond his understanding or control. And every day, as he worked his land and watched the horizon, Ethan carried the knowledge that his life mattered not because of grand accomplishments or dramatic heroics, but because, when tested, when faced with choice between convenient and right, he'd chosen right and accepted whatever consequences followed. In the end, that was enough. That was everything.